Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 27th of January 2025. The prison system has been operating at close to full capacity since autumn 2022, with many prisons severely crowded. In 2021, the government committed to build 20,000 new prison places in response to rapidly increasing prison demand forecasts. The NAO reported that this is now not expected to be delivered until 2031, 5 years later than planned, and at an increased cost of £4.2 billion. In response to extreme pressure on available prison spaces, the government has enacted emergency measures, taking a reactive and costly approach to try and increase capacity urgently. Today we will be questioning witnesses about how they are managing the increased demand for prison places, the impact of crisis on prisoners, staff and the public, and their long-term strategy for delivering the prison estate that is fit for the future. So to help us with all of that, we extend a very warm welcome to our witnesses. Firstly to Dame Antonia Romeo, DCB, Permanent Secretary and Clerk of the Crown in Chancery. Not quite sure what that is, but perhaps you'll tell us in a minute, Dame Antonia. You were appointed Accounting Officer of the Ministry of Justice in 2021. Ross Gribbin, on my right, Director General of Prisons, Offenders and International Justice. Ross was permanently appointed as Director General in the Ministry of Justice Policy Group in April 2023, and it's his first appearance before the PAC, so a special warm welcome to you. For HM Prison and Probation Service, we have Amy Rees on my extreme left, CPE, Director General of the Chief Executive. Amy was appointed Director General Chief Executive of HMPPS in August 22. And finally, by no means least, Jim Barton, Executive Director, HMPPS Change. Jim Barton is responsible for the prison expansion portfolio, electronic monitoring service and overall oversight of HMPPS Change portfolio. Dame Antonia, since I raised the question, perhaps you would tell us what the Clerk of the Crown in Chancery exactly is.
Traditionally, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Justice is also the Clerk of the Crown in Chancery, which is an office which oversees the Crown Office. And in this role, I am the King's Sign Manual for letters patent and also take the formal record of any coronations.
Very good.
Thank you for asking.
We've learned something this afternoon, or at least I have anyway. So to start our proceedings this afternoon on prison estate capacity, I turn to Luke Charteris, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. The reality is that you've known about the lack of capacity in the prison estate for many years, and dare I say you've actually been good at forecasting the fact that there would be a future shortfall. But isn't the reality that you've presided over effectively a ticking time bomb where demand would eventually outstrip supply at some point?
So, I mean, you're right to say that it was known for some time that the lines we call the lines crossing, which is where demand will exceed supply. And as you'll have seen from our annual capacity statement that we published last December, we in fact also see the lines, absent significant intervention, crossing again. So the HMPPS has been operating, the prison service has been operating at near to full capacity for many years. It's a good opportunity to thank the excellent leadership and also the staff for the fact that they have kept the system going in that period. Successive governments have essentially two types of method to address this. The supply side, so that's the prison build programme I'm sure we'll be going on to. So that could be new builds, house blocks, rapid deployment cells, etc. And the demand programme, which will be essentially policy measures, of which the previous government and this government have also done a number, which I'm sure we'll also go into. So there's been a huge amount being done in order to keep the system sustainable and keep the whole of the criminal justice system going.
We'll get into the details of the supply and demand question, but may I just end my little section, if I can draw your attention to paragraph 3.13 in the NAO report. And effectively, what this states is that back in 2021, the projection that demand would outstrip supply was a known quantum, it was a known reality, that the spending review in 2021 knowingly would leave a capacity gap of nearly 1,000 places. So how did that come to fruition? And surely that was some shortcoming in the settlement process.
Well, so obviously we have been bidding for money to build the prisons places required to deliver that. That's happened in over a period. I mean, as you'll know, we started until about 2020, the forecast was roughly flat for prison projections, but then it started to go up significantly, partly to do with new police officers that previous government was planning to recruit, partly to do with the results of COVID, and there were other things that exacerbated this, including more longer sentences and people spending longer on sentence in the population. So as a result, we therefore bid for more money to have a big prisons programme. That is the 20,000 programme that we're here to talk about. It was known that we were going to be under a lot of pressure. We have been negotiating funding settlements with the Treasury in successive spending rounds to try and have the money to both build new places, but also importantly, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, maintain those places we have to reduce dilapidation and to reduce the number of cells that need to be taken offline. So it has been known, and we've done a lot to address it.
Just to close, was it therefore that you were not so good as a department for bidding for money, or was it the question that ministers at the time were not forthcoming with the funding settlement that was actually needed to stop this shortfall from arising?
I don't think, you won't find many perm secs who will say there's a correlation between being good at bidding and the money that you'll then end up being given. I think it's fair to say
ministers didn't give you enough money to tackle the crisis.
Well, we were given money. I think we were given money for the 10,000 programme in the first SR, I think it was SR19, and then for the 20,000. And a number of things have meant that the costs of these programmes have gone up hugely. So I think it's a combination of a range of things. I don't think it's the case that had we been given more money at the outset, because I'm sure we'll get onto, planning permission has had delays in planning has had a massive role in this, and that has obviously led to significant increases in cost of the supply programme. There were a number of unexpected things as well that have happened. So I don't think it's as straightforward as to say if we had been given more money, we wouldn't have found ourselves in the position that we have been in, although obviously money has sometimes been a limiting factor.
So, Dame Antonia, just to clarify, the Lord Chancellor in her 10-year forward strategy announced in December codified for the first time, or at least it's the first time I've ever seen it, we shall still project the prison population to increase by an average of 3,000 annually over the coming years. So are all the projections that you're going to tell us about today taking that into account?
Yes. This was the first of its time, and actually, as the Lord Chancellor says in her foreword, this is a very important, it's a crucial moment, because it's one of the ways to ensure that there is full transparency about both the prison build projections, but also what we're expecting in terms of demand. Now, the demand projections have actually been, over the time, pretty accurate in terms of, generally speaking, the central projection has been where we've ended up. But of course, forecasting is always inherently, there's some uncertainty around it. So I think it's fair to say that this is going to be essential, this annual publication, because it is going to allow us to see on an annual basis where we are on demand and supply, and to forecast when the lines might cross again.
Does that figure, does it or does it not take into account demand-side measures, for example, what might come out of the sentencing review, or the reducing of remand from 50% to 40% of sentence served?
So in line with all government published figures, we haven't included those figures of changes due to policies which have not yet been made or legislated for. So what may or may not come out of the sentencing review has not been taken into account. And in fact, what we will need the sentencing review, or rather the government's response to the sentencing review, to help us manage the gap that the document you're referring to, Sir Geoffrey, indicates. It does include measures already taken. So it does include, for example, what we call SDS 40, which is the reduction of the SDS point from 50 to 40.
Thank you for that helpful remark. Before I call Clive Betts, I should just extend a warm welcome to Andy Slaughter, who's Chairman of the Justice Committee. You're very welcome to guest on this committee today, Andy.
Thank you very much.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Chair. 2021, you committed to build 20,000 new prison places by the mid-2020s. Do you regret having made that commitment?
Well, I think, no. I don't think the government would regret making an ambitious commitment to delivering something that was required. I think the The key question is what all the things that happened since that meant that that there was a degree of slippage in the delivery of the 20,000, most from planning permission, but from other things as well, that meant that it didn't deliver according to the original timetable set. But I don't think that the government would regret making a commitment.
Right. A degree of slippage might be a polite way of addressing a major failure, wouldn't it?
Well, planning permission, Garth has been 40 months in planning. There's no way that could have been predicted. So is it a major failure that a prison has spent that long in planning? I mean, I would say it's just part of the process of building major infrastructure programmes.
How many new prisons had actually got planning permission when you made the commitment?
When we made that commitment, I think the team will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 3 had them. 3 had them and 3 did not have them. And of those 3 that did not have them, 2 have now got them, and 1 indeed is subject to a further challenge.
Wouldn't it have been reasonable since the beginning that planning might be an issue which delayed some of those projects?
Yes.
So that was a mistake.
What was the mistake?
Not making assumptions about delays in planning, which were probably fairly foreseeable.
Well, so, I mean, Jim will be able to give more detail on this, but essentially the story is this. First of all, the timetable of the original timetable was set out during a period of something called Project Speed, which the government of the day was, it was a kind of Treasury and Cabinet Office-led initiative to essentially streamline and massively speed up planning approvals. All infrastructure projects at the time were working on the basis that Project Speed would deliver. I mean, this is referred to in the document. That was not in fact implemented, so as a result there were delays there. I think even aside from that, the degree of delay we have seen in both the planning decisions and also then the fact of even having PPA, I can't remember what it stands for, but the early planning approvals that we were given in 2 of those 3 prisons did not then lead to actual planning approval. So I think we found ourselves in a far more delayed situation than can reasonably have been anticipated, albeit I agree that actually, obviously, the original planning under Project Speed on the basis of speeding up of planning processes that did not in fact materialise was, in retrospect, it would have been better not to have planned for Project Speed to have delivered what it said it would deliver.
It was the Treasury's fault then?
Absolutely not. I'm just saying it was the government, I'm pointing out it was the government's policy position that projects should plan according to the principles of Project Speed.
Who was in charge of Project Speed making it work then?
Well, I mean, it was a government-wide initiative.
Somebody has to be responsible in the government-wide decision.
Well, I mean, I think it was Treasury and Cabinet Office led, was it?
So it's Treasury and Cabinet Office then responsible.
I don't think it's helpful to be kind of like blaming. All I'm saying, I'm stating the facts. Well, I mean, it's not for me.
It's perfectly reasonable, surely.
I'm just stating the facts. We set the project plans according to Project Speed principles. Those Project Speed principles were not in the end delivered by the government at the time, and we therefore have re-baselined the programme, and that, among other things, has been a reason for delay.
So before Mr. Betts goes on to his next question, it isn't just planning permission, is it, that delays prison building? It's the actual contract itself. And so what assessments have you made of that? Because you've now got planning permission on 3 out of 4 of the new prisons. From this moment, how long will it take to get a brand new, from the moment of having got planning permission, how long will it take to get a brand new prison into operation?
Well, I'm going to hand over to Jim. I mean, I would
yes,
say it's about 3 years in the actual.
So the 3 further prisons that we're building at Garth, Gartree and Grendon, they'll open essentially 1 in each of the years, 29, 30, 31, very early in 31. We are in the ground preparing the site at one of those 3 sites already in anticipation of getting the positive planning decision. That was obviously subject to very careful consideration as to whether that was money well spent in anticipation of receiving that outcome. But what I might just add, though, is within the 20k portfolio, the area where we have had greater success when we've got through the planning process has been in new prison builds. So both Fossway and Five Wells, which are now open and full, were delivered to time. And it was critically worded at the time, given the acute pressures that we were facing in terms of prison capacity over the course of the last couple of years. I'm not in any way suggesting this is the antidote to some of the criticisms set out in the NEO report, but Fossway has recently won Programme of the Year across the civil service. That's a testament to the fact that we know how to build prisons when we get through factors that are out with our control.
Well done. Just one supplementary to that question. I mean, do you have what the health service is striving to, what I call a model prison design, so you can replicate from one to the other? And is that one of the reasons why you've been able to build it on time and on budget? Thank you.
You would go across those 6 prisons once built, and you might struggle to spot the differences between them. There are differences. We're improving it every time, but the essential design is the same.
In fact, we were all at a visit to Millsyke, which is our prison that's about to open in spring of this year, and they were saying that in this point in the previous 2 projects they had many more snaggings than they've got now, and that is because we are replicating a design, learning every time. There are some site-specific issues, but it has made us much more slick.
So problems like line of sight and ancillary buildings
Exactly.
and all that sort of thing you've ironed out in the standard design.
Yeah.
Well done. Well done.
So
Clerk.
in terms of the problems with planning then, you're saying that they weren't problems with these new built prisons that you just mentioned?
So the 3 prisons that we have built, or 2 open, 1 about to open, were all on 2 sites where we previously had prisons and knocked them down to replace them with larger prisons. Five Wells and Fossway. Millsyke is adjacent to an existing prison. We've got through that process much easier than we've experienced the other 3, which partly I think goes to the points that Permanent Secretary has made, that it was reasonable to assume, as we did, that getting through planning in 26 weeks, which was the planning assumption, that's what we baked in, was possible. The view across government at that time was the best case version of that was 13 weeks. That felt very speedy, to pun maybe not intended, so we included 26 weeks. Of those 3 prisons, 2, the local authority planning official recommended that planning was approved at the first event. If that had happened, we would have secured planning well within that 26-week window.
Right. They're on sites which already had a prison?
No, sorry, I was moving on to talk about the further 3. Apologies for not making that clear.
Okay.
So of the 3, we assumed 26 weeks in our plan would be sufficient to secure full planning.
And were these sites which were earmarked in the local plan for such development?
Not at the outset, no, but we had extensive engagement with the local planning officials. And as I mentioned earlier, prior to the planning committee meeting, the recommendation on 2 out of 3 was that the application was approved.
Just without knowing all the details, it does sound to me extremely optimistic to think you can suddenly announce that a prison is going to be built on a site with no reference to it in the local plan, and it's going to go through just like that.
They're all adjacent to existing prisons.
Right, okay, but nevertheless, it is a site newly identified. It just seems to me very optimistic, which it proved to be at the end of the day, didn't it?
I mean, you can take different reference points. I think if the kind of challenge back is we should credibly have included in our plans an assumption that it would take 3.5 years to go through a planning process to secure permission to build a prison that the local planning official supported adjacent to an existing prison. That doesn't feel like a kind of credible basis upon which any project or department or government could proceed.
It's also worth adding that we only go for planning where we think it is reasonable and proper to build a prison there and that it can meet with all the local planning requirements, etc. So obviously those 3 are whittled down from a long list of places we could have built, and those are the ones that we thought were best to go for.
So you think your assurances about the future and your new commitment then to build by 2031, the number of places required, that all the potential problems have been built into those forecasts, have they? So they're absolutely certain now you can deliver on that.
Well, the third one, the one where we don't have planning, one where we're still subject to an appeal. I think one thing of many things that we have learnt is that we'd be insane to suggest that's definitely not going to have any problems now. I mean, it's still subject to an appeal.
So the commitment to 2031 is still not certain then?
I mean, there's a huge amount of kind of factors that go towards building a project that costs many hundreds of millions of pounds over 6 to 7 years, and I would not, of course, feel confident sitting here today saying absolutely everything is within our control and that can be achieved. But we make allowance for it within our planning. So to give you an indication of that, we use a tool called reference class forecasting to try and learn from other projects across government in different jurisdictions to understand how likely it is that things will go as we expect them to do. We then weight our plans in terms of both time and money to take account of that. So we build more contingency into the timeline where it is more risky. So as an example, we're planning to extend a Category D prison at HMP Ford. We assess that as being P43 on this kind of index of 0 to 100. That means we've added in 50% contingency into the time schedule. So we take account of that risk in the way that we plan.
It's also worth adding, the particular point on planning, that 95% of that remaining 14,000 now has outline planning. But that would include Garth, for example, that now has a judicial review. And also, yes, you, Sir Geoffrey, alluded to things beyond planning. So we've obviously had 2 firms that have gone bust and into administration. These are the sorts of things it's almost impossible to forecast.
We're coming
for
on.
Time.
I think we'll come on to ISG and we'll come on, I think, back to planning towards the end of the hearing. But thank you for that for now. Clive, are you?
Yes.
You're finished. So next, Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Costs have increased a lot. I think it's fair to say. According to the report, costs have increased between 80% and 93%. And when we're looking at figure 4, we can see that the biggest cost increase is in the rapid deployment cells. So I wonder, Mr. Barton, if you can tell us, because the specific cost increase here is between 247 and 259%. And I think I'm right in saying that the rapid deployment cells have not been deployed very rapidly. Could you tell us why it is that the costs have increased so much?
Absolutely. So as of today, we've opened about 770 rapid deployment cells across the estate that are currently being utilised. So just over half the total that we're expecting to deliver in full. There are essentially 3 factors that have contributed towards that cost increase. The first is that we have developed the design from the point of that original quote. So we've worked with our contractors to ensure that we've got facilities that we think best meet prisoner need, best meet the needs of the local establishment. So that has added costs through the process. These are not kind of porter cabins that we buy from a generic supplier. They are tailor-made to our needs.
Can I just quickly ask then, so you think that the original spec turned out not to be appropriate for what you needed it for?
I think as we do across the 20K, we've continued to revise and review that spec as we move closer to production. So it's the very early cost estimates. And then as you get closer to having finalised plans, having an understanding of the full cost of that design. Of the 3 factors I referenced, so that's the smallest in terms of its component impact. The second has been site-specific costs. So for a lot of these projects, we're inserting RDCs into the corners of existing prisons. These prisons, many of them were built over 100 years ago, 60 years ago. They're incredibly complex sites. And just as with some of the other 20K projects, as you get into the ground, we have uncovered challenges that have added to cost. So asbestos on site, issues around ground conditions not being as stable as we had anticipated and therefore requiring more underpinnings. So that has added significant cost. And the more expensive end of the RDC project, the actual accommodation itself makes up something like 25 to 30% of the cost. The remainder is going on everything else required to get them installed and make them operational. And then the third factor takes us back to the conversation earlier around delays. So one of the other issues that we've experienced in projects across the 20K, but it's impacted several RDC sites specifically, are delays linked to nutrient neutrality. So this is regulations that require us to be able to offset the impact of additional grey water running into local waterways. The challenge we've got in some of our projects is that there are not schemes established for us to be able to offset the impact of those projects by buying nutrient neutrality credits. That's led in, I think, the worst case to the delays of close to a year at some of those RDC projects, because we simply cannot proceed through to full construction. We can't lawfully proceed until we've been able to remedy those nutrient neutrality issues. That's something we've been working with colleagues across government on, lots of work underway as to what the right policy solutions to that might be. But right here, right now, we've obviously got to work within that regulatory framework.
Which of those three issues that you identified has been sort of most relevant to the cost going up on the RDCs?
Site conditions.
I beg your pardon?
Site conditions.
Site conditions. So the challenges around sort of asbestos and ground conditions.
And if I may, it's a factor across the 20k, in that we started, as I think any sensible person would, with the more straightforward sites. So the sites that were quicker into approval and construction were where we had more space, fewer operational constraints, more confidence in the conditions in which we were building. As we've moved through the programme and added further projects to get us towards that very necessary target of 20,000, we have taken on projects that were further down our priority list because we were aware there may be challenges with them. We're working through those challenges, but they contribute towards that increase in cost.
Thank you. Dame Antonia, the report highlights that there's now a very wide spread of costs per prison place. In some of the some parts of the programme, the cost per place is only 200,000, but in a small number of individual projects, it might cost up to $1 million. What do you think is the maximum amount per place that the MOJ should be prepared to pay for?
Well, so as Jim says, the way the process works is in a way you try and pick you always go for the highest value for money first, but also as you get to a point where you need to have you've still got to have more places being brought on stream, then inevitably you have to go for more expensive places. In some cases, obviously, there's also a sunk cost element.
So I can understand on that logic there being a range, but there must surely be an upper edge at which you kind of say, right, this is now too expensive and we aren't prepared to pursue this option. Well,
it's really quite complex because, of course, in a lot of those cases, that won't have been the number that at the point all business cases will be signed off by Amy as AO and then me as PA as Principal Accounting Officer. There will have been a value for money test on all of those. In a situation like RDCs, where these were very ambitious, it was completely new at the time that we were first doing the design of it. It was something new that could be brought on quickly. It was a totally different type of accommodation that could be put in the ground more quickly, we thought. Therefore, by the time we were actually on tranche 4 or 5, there were some of those costs it didn't seem would be worth doing. And in fact, there was a tranche of RDCs which we as AO and as Principal Accounting Officer, we did not agree to because of the cost. But it's not really necessarily about cost per place, because it can also they can end up being quite expensive when you've already sunk quite a lot of that cost. So there's no actual cut-off that one says more than this is too expensive. It all depends on proximity to full capacity, requirement, how quickly they can be brought on stream, and then the cost that's going to be paid and the reason for that cost.
So can I ask one of you? I mean, if you look at the Lord Chancellor's table on page 8 of her 10-year strategy, it does look at these rapid deployment cells are a relatively small amount of the total capacity you're going to bring on stream. So are they really the last resort rather than the first resort? You only use them when you need to keep up your delivery, if you like, of new places. In normal terms, because they're expensive, because they only have a life of 10 years, you wouldn't normally use them.
Well, look, I'm going to say some things, and Jim will have, and indeed Amy might want to comment as well. As originally envisaged, we were going to be bringing on 1,000 when they were first identified. Obviously, in an ideal world, if you're going to have your big prison builds, and you're going to, build really good, new, green, smart prisons. But actually, there's a limit to how many of those you can do. So you've got to operate the estate you already have. house blocks is a good example of something, small secure house blocks. There are lots of different types of accommodation. RDCs were envisaged to be a new type of accommodation that would be more quick to bring in. They're not suitable for all types of prisoners. They're only for Cat C or Cat D, and they don't last as long. They last something like 15 years. So they're not as good in that regard, because by definition, if they're only going to last 15 years, they're not going to be as good value for money. But if they can be brought in more quickly and they can be more flexible. The other thing to say is at the time that they were initially being designed and thought of, the fact of bringing in a new type of accommodation was worth something in itself, because it gave us much more flexibility. So you can imagine we're always trying to think about how we can be more innovative in how we're providing accommodation in ways that could, over time, deliver much higher value for money. And they represented as that. As I say, by the time we got onto what we thought was going to be the 5th tranche, we had in fact decided that the cost, because of the site conditions, they weren't going to be better value for money. But in principle, they had a lot to offer. And in fact, as Jim said, we've brought on 770. We're going to be bringing on another 1,000. So they are going to be offering quite a lot in terms of capacity.
Straightforwardly, just to answer, operationally, my answer to your question is no, they are not a last resort, because they've brought something really additional and helpful to the prison estate. They are really high quality accommodation, so it's some of our best accommodation out there in the estate. As the Permanent Secretary says, they're only for risk assessed Cat C and Cat D prisoners, but this offers a really good kind of step, if you like, from coming out of normal prisons, very big landings, all the things that happen, into living more independently as a step towards being released or perhaps going to the open estate. And because when we are trying to transition people into resettlement, there are only certain places in the country that you can do those things. People need to be able to access jobs, etc., which really means operationally we need to be able to use quite small parcels of lands in existing site, which is where this has offered something really genuinely new and helpful.
I'll just check one thing. We haven't got into a situation now, because they're so specialist, that we're only getting one supplier. There is a bit of a competition in the market to keep the price down, is there?
We contract with two suppliers.
Yeah, 2 suppliers.
Yep.
Have you thought about asking any of the Scandinavian countries who produce a lot of these things to compete in this market?
As with all of our procurements, we've kind of gone out to open market, taken in any bid and tender with a company that's got an interest. The 2 suppliers that we went with were the best providers on price and quality at that point in time. And perhaps back to the earlier question, the cost of the unit itself is not really the factor that is driving some of the kind of points of observation and concern within the NEO reports.
So Geoffrey, you're right to identify that the tightness of the supply market is one of the issues, in terms of Orning's point about, and not just in RDCs, but generally about costs going up. That's one of the big issues that we face.
Thank you. Ms. Olney.
Thank you. Mr. Gribbin, I think one of the issues identified by the report was the fact that because places were needed so urgently, that in itself contributed to costs increasing, for example, needing to pay a larger margin to contractors to accept higher levels of risk. So do you have a sense of what additional costs you've incurred because the need for places became so urgent?
Well, I think we give transparent estimates of costs. I mean, I think there's quite a range of reasons why the places were needed. As you say, as your colleague said, we predicted this at the start of the last Parliament. There were then sort of some years where the kind of plans were in place. So could you give us a bit more as to what exactly you're looking for here?
Well, just the extent to which the need to provide places urgently as a standalone reason for the driving costs upwards, as in if projects hadn't been delayed and therefore the need for the places wasn't so urgent, to what extent has that had an impact on costs?
Well, I don't think we've disaggregated just the costs for it being required urgently, because you've heard from my other colleagues there are a number of reasons why these places were required, and again, as has just been observed, all the different categories of accommodation have got different costs, so I'm not sure if it'd be possible to give you that disaggregation that you're looking for.
But do you accept that the increasing urgency of the need for places has had an impact on the increase in cost?
Well, yes. I mean, it's certainly the case, obviously, that if it's necessary to do something quickly, it will likely cost more than if you had a long time to sort it. On the other hand, some of the inflation cost increases that have taken place over time have added to cost as well. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as just saying that things done quickly are more costly than things done over a long period.
I think that I totally agree with that. The cost delay leads to cost, not least because the inflation that we faced in the construction market has been so significant.
Yeah.
So over time, costs go up significantly. But it is also the case that obviously the swifter you need to bring something online, the often it can lead to increased cost in itself. So there are other, and not least, as we've demonstrated with the RDCs, you start with the ones that are the best value for money, or the easiest, I suppose. They often end up being the best value for money because of ground conditions. Over time, you would expect, as you have to go into more and more, bring more and more new places online, costs might go up. But it's kind of, it's complicated.
And where we can accelerate delivery, we will. So to give an example, a new house block at Rye Hill, which is due to open in the next few weeks, we have opted to pay slightly more for the delivery of that project months earlier than it would otherwise have come online through weekend working, longer shifts. That's subject to very detailed kind of assessment around is the value of having those places for the weeks or months acceleration that we get worth it, rather than just money being kind of thrown at contractors. But we look actively at where we can accelerate delivery through those kind of measures.
Thank you. Mr. Rees, what will you do when the temporary accommodation that's currently being used to house prisoners reaches the end of its design life, or its intended life?
What we will do is what we do with the rest of the estate, which we will assess the condition and whether it can go beyond 15 years reasonably and safely, and when it can't, it will come out of dilapidations. And we've had to take our previous version of RDCs, we had temporary modular units. We had to take some of those out in the last 5 years because they did reach the end of their serviceable life. So what we will do is assess it always for condition assets, and then we will decide whether or not it's reasonable to keep it in play or not. And in the end, that's a straightforward kind of value for money judgment.
I hope, Ms. Rees, we won't get into the situation the Education Department's got itself into with Elliott buildings, which were designed for 25 years, and I've still got some in my constituency after 40 years.
So it's certainly true to say we have got, I've just referred to one, those modular units went a lot longer than their original lifespan, but when they came to the end of the place where I could safely keep prisoners in there and our staff to work there, we took them out of use, and that had a reasonable spike in our dilapidations over the last 5 years because we had to take these modular units out of use.
Thank you.
And finally, Mr. Barton, the ISG was one of your main contractors, gone into administration last September. To what extent is that going to delay delivery of some of your projects?
It will, but those delays are reflected in the forecast that we published in December, to the best of our ability to forecast it. So we had a significant exposure to ISG. They were contracted across 13 sites, 13 projects within the 20k portfolio, adding up to about 3,500 places in which they had some involvement. So the projects have been delayed. To give you an example, I live in Birmingham, HMP Birmingham, the Victorian house blocks are being refurbed. They're stripped back to bare brick at the moment. We had a tower crane in the middle of the prison. We had to close that site, that bit of the prison, overnight when ISG went into administration, make it safe. That is now done. We're now in the process with commercial colleagues of looking to re-tender those contracts across those 13 projects. We're doing that in as speedy a way as we can, while obviously keeping a clear eye on value for money. But we expect it will have a significant impact in terms of both cost. So our estimate is circa £300 million. Again, that's in the figures in the NEO report. And also delays. The delays are quite site-specific because it depends upon the stage of completion that they're at. But some projects could be delayed by up to a year. Again, just kind of emphasise those delays or our assumptions around them are built into the forecast that we published before this year. But fair to say that ISG going into administration has been a significant issue and challenge for 20k. It may be something we should come back to later in the session, but it has also had a significant impact on fire safety maintenance as well.
Our exposure was actually more on the maintenance side than it was really on the 20k.
Okay.
Can I just clarify that, Mr. Barton? Because if I take you to paragraph 3.8, you've got places at risk of enforcement action by the Crown Premises Fire and Safety Inspectorate. Were ISG involved in that contract, and can we be assured that the fire bringing cells up to fire safety standards will not be put at risk because ISG has gone out of business?
So some straightforward answers. Yes, they were involved. Yes, it will put at risk the completion by 2027, but it won't change the outcome, because if those places are not remediated by end of 27, we will take them out of action.
And just one final question. Without ISG, is there capacity in the market that you're contracting from to deliver the remaining project, or is that going to be a constraint?
So we believe the capacity is there, around 20k. Amy may want to add something around fire safety and maintenance. But fair to say that market has its challenges, and I think they're not at all specific to building within the context of prisons. I think they're quite well reported on within the trade press.
So there are two issues. I do think in the maintenance capacity will be an issue in terms of capacity in the market and how we do that. The other issue is I have to carefully sequence how I take places out of use. And now, of course, that's been messed up, for want of a better word. And so I will have to figure out how we resequence where we take places out of use in order to maintain our headroom, make full use of the estate, manage all the different geographical parts of the estate, which means that we may not have completed the remediation by the end of 2027. But as I say, our commitment is we'll take them out of use until such time as they can be remediated.
Just very final question. So the collapse of ISG is going to impact the provision of prison places quite significantly, but it's actually not primarily due to not being able to build the new ones. It's about maintaining the old ones and the impact that that's going to have on the existing.
It's a mixture of both. We're exposed on both, but there's actually more cells on the maintenance side than there are on the new build side.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah Green.
Thank
We've
you,
got
Chair.
lots of Sarahs on this committee.
Thank you, Chair. And just to pick up on the what we were just discussing, I'm just going to refer to paragraph 1.25 in the NAO report, which says that since the 2010 prison strategy, HMPPS has indefinitely closed 4,151 cells due to dilapidation, which is more than the combined capacity of the two newest prisons in the estate, Five Wells and Fosse Way. So my question to Dame Antonia and to Ross Gribbin, if I may, is how do you consider the trade-offs between investing in prison maintenance versus prison expansion?
Well, look, I'll say something and then Ross will want to add. So the first thing to say is we're actually working out. There's no perfect algorithm for the kind of marginal benefit of keeping a cell online versus building a new one. But generally speaking, it's better to do maintenance. I mean, overall, Amy and Jim will correct me operationally if this isn't right, because once you've got the place, if you can maintain it and stop it going out of use, it's much more expensive, as per Mazzolni's questions, trying to have to build a new prison, a new house, EC, etc. But obviously, you can't plan for always being able to maintain your cells, and as Amy has said, she's going to take them out of use in order to maintain them, so we've got to do both. So we have a big programme of building, and that is essentially alongside that, we've got a big programme of maintenance, so we do both things.
And Antonia has already said we do both. I mean, of course, some of those decisions were taken before the projections that you're now looking at were in place. And of course, some of the reasons that the population is now growing are new decisions that have been taken kind of since. So I think we should be sort of careful judging some of those things in hindsight. In addition, it's not always the case that all places can be maintained safely, and Amy and Jim might want to say a bit more on that. So I think where places can be maintained, the department does it. Where it can't, we build more. And in both cases, we're looking ahead to see how many places we need.
What assurance can you give us that you've got that balance right between maintenance and expansion?
Well, essentially, we're maintaining, I mean, as you'll know, we've got the investment for this year is 220 million into maintenance, and for next year is 300 million. And meanwhile, we've got 2.3 billion over those 2 years for the new build programme. So we're running at full pelt to do both, because the lines crossing means that we have to do the maximum amount that we can do. So it's not so much about a balance. We're never defunding one thing to do the other. we're making judgments, and Amy's got a lot of very particular operational red lines, statutory responsibilities on fire safety, etc., that she has to worry about when she's thinking about cells being kept online and maintaining them, etc. Meanwhile, we've got a big prison build programme which has got to deliver over 20,000 new places, 14,000 still to come. So, we're doing both. We've got a detailed programme plan for both. We're not really seeking to balance in that sense, unless I've misunderstood you.
No, you hadn't misunderstood. Thank you, Chair.
Please may I just add, just operationally, straightforwardly, if you're saying, would I like a lot more money on maintenance and would I like to do more maintenance? The answer is resounding and absolute yes. But money isn't the only constraint that I need to manage maintenance in terms of an existing estate. There are two others. One is the capacity of the market to do much more maintenance, because on the whole, coming into a prison, a working prison, to do maintenance is quite a long-winded job. It's quite a lot of exposure if you're an organisation, etc. You have to have security clearances for everyone working there, etc., etc. And the third is that I've got to have the headroom in the estate in order to take places off use to maintain them. So there are quite a lot of constraints to how much maintenance we can do. The Perm Secretary alluded to one of my red lines, and one of my red lines was that we would keep a minimum number of 1,500 places offline to keep my essential maintenance doing. But to go beyond essential maintenance into kind of flooring, not nice to do things, I would need to take more places offline, which has proved very difficult over the last few years.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Nevertheless, Ms Rees, the Permanent Secretary is right. It is much cheaper to maintain than build new places. And given that the NAO say in paragraph 1.24 that a backlog between 0.9 billion and 1.8 billion has built up, it would seem sensible to surcharge this maintenance somewhat. And I ask you, therefore, Permanent Secretary, whether 200 million a year on maintenance is enough, given that scale of backlog.
Not enough.
Not enough.
It's not enough. We need, as HMPPS have revealed, we need 2.8 billion to totally remediate. We're given in
with
this
all the fire.
In the current SR, we were given specifically 220 and 300, and we can all do the maths. We're going to need a lot more money in the next spending round in order to begin to make inroads into the maintenance.
But just to be clear, to reiterate myself, I'd need more headroom and more market capacity as well to go much beyond 300 million.
Absolutely understood. So can we take it, Permanent Secretary, without wishing to divulge any confidences, you will be making a strong cases in the spending round for more money for maintenance?
I look forward to the PAC report suggesting that more money should be found for maintenance of prisons.
It's a two-way thing. We can help each other. Now, then, we've come to Clive, please. Clive Betts.
Just following on that, back to the new build situation. So, are you confident you're going to have the resources, the finance, to actually build the number of places you're committed to build by 2031?
Yes, I think we now... Well, I'd say, first of all, can't prejudge upcoming spending rounds, and... So I've got to, at some point, it all depends on the money that I'm given in the spending round. But I think it's reasonable. We work very closely with the Treasury on the plans. They're a crucial part, as are the IPA, of our programme planning teams and of all levels of assurance. And they sign off all the business cases. And as Amy said, we've got over 90% have now got planning, and the work's actually started. So I'm as confident as I would want to be that, yes.
Okay, so just move on to I think we explored the questions to an extent before. If you got the money, you think it's going to be there, going to be confirmed in the spending review. With the money available, are you going to deliver the places for certain by 2031?
I think you're looking at Jim, but do you want to go first, Jim, and then...
Whoever wants to be looked at.
So I'm at risk of repeating the comments I made before, so as certain as we can be. So we make allowance for the fact that there are inherent uncertainties in building complex things like prisons, particularly where we're inserting capacity into existing prison sites. That's where it's more challenging, not the new prisons. We allow for that in our planning assumptions in the way that I described before.
Or I was just going to add to Sir Geoffrey's point earlier, the thing that we have all definitely learned on this side of the table is the more you do these things, the more you replicate the design, the more we have a very clear route to it, the slicker and better the chances that we will deliver it on time. Stop-start is the worst thing we can do for the market, for the design, for how sure we're going to be that we're going to deliver it.
Have you made any changes yourselves? Processes, procedures, resources that are needed to actually deliver? Have you learnt lessons from the previous period when delivery wasn't achieved?
So yes, I mean there's quite a few things that we've done which I can speak and others will have thoughts as well. So the first thing is that we've done a number of internal reviews in order to essentially learn the lessons of what's happened on the supply side. So some of the reviews are referred to in the report. In particular in 2022 we had a peer review by Network Rail. We also had a review by Stanhope, and then I asked the IPA particularly to do a review into our DCs and our delivery of them. And we've put in place we already had, I would say, kind of quite reasonably good governance in some of these areas following a governance review I'd done in 2021 on our delivery of major programmes. But we significantly strengthened both the governance for the programmes and the kind of assessment of delivery following those reviews. I can say a bit more about that, what's helpful, but that's helpful. But one of the things, for example, is the investment committee every month is looking at prison supply and the investments we're making and the money we're making to ensure value for money. We've got a portfolio committee and a delivery board, all of which are overseeing this, and that's on top of the regular programme boards, Amy's audit and risk committee in HMPPS, my audit and risk committee in MOJ. So I think the governance to flag issues is significantly improved, and that gives me some confidence. The other thing I would say is just referring again to both, as well as the 10-year prison capacity strategy, also the annual statement of capacity. These are things that now set out strategically what we intend to do and how we are going to deliver those places. So just the transparency of having published now what the plan is, I think, is another example. And then perhaps finally to talk about capability, we have a very significant large multidisciplinary teams. There's something like 100 FTE equivalent of commercial and property staff from MOJ supporting the programme team. As Jim said, in fact, the Fossway programme team did recently win the Civil Service Award, so, quick shout out to them. But we've also got about 340 professional services resources that are supporting on things like technical assurance, risk, contracts, health and safety. So we've got a lot of capability in this. We hope to get the money secured. We've been working with the Treasury on that in the next SR. We think we will. And we have set out our published plan. So I think we've given ourselves as strong a chance as we could, albeit in all of these big infrastructure projects, there's always the risk of something uncertain happening, asbestos, radon, whatever it may be. But I think, reasonably confident.
Just one change that has happened is the change in the MPPF now to recognise the importance of sites for major infrastructure. Is that going to be beneficial? Have you looked at that, what it might mean for your projects going forward?
So we're going to do a slightly different thing. Do you mean about the national security?
Well, the
nationally significant.
Yeah, so I actually, Jim will be able to explain this, but that is not in itself what we're relying on. We're relying on a different Crown development route, which we think will be faster for us.
So exactly that. So we've had really good support from colleagues in MHCLG around all of those intended reforms to the planning regime. We considered in detail whether we should bid to be included in the changes that were announced last week around nationally critical infrastructure. We decided on balance that was not the right way to try and accelerate future planning permissions for new prisons, on the basis that the way that's designed is more around things like the Thames Tunnel and others, where there's an extensive public consultation period that just does not apply in prisons and we would not want it to do. So instead, we're relying on the planned changes to Crown development routes that will essentially just reduce and potentially remove the risk that we get stuck in such a prolonged cycle of local planning decisions being remitted to the centre, going back out to the local authority. So it's utilisation of the proposed changes to Crown development routes, which I understand are due to come into force over the course of the next couple of months, that is the thing we see de-risking as ending up in a future Garth or Grendon or Gartree when we're bidding for the next planning.
Bypasses local planning.
As I understand it, it expedites the process to bring that into a central decision making. It's government policy that's being worked through.
Local planning committees.
It removes some of the powers that currently sit with local planning commissions.
Bypass. Local planning committees no longer have any say in whether a prison is built.
Although, to be clear, we're not responsible for planning policy, right? So we're just taking advantage of the route.
Description of what the situation is.
So you're right, in the main, it brings that decision into a central government decision.
Can I just perhaps wade in here as a child surveyor who knows something about this? Part of the problems with procuring asylum homes sites were that the local communities weren't consulted. And I just think if you do go for this Crown procedure, which, as Mr. Betts says, does bypass the local planning, it's still important that the local communities are involved in the decision making.
Absolutely. And one of the things we have learnt off the back of the experience at Gartrey and Grendon is, while we did put effort into engaging local communities, we should have done more. And it's not in our interest to build a prison in a community that is opposed to that prison being built. A challenge I'm not sure we've yet kind of properly worked our way through is there is incredible benefit to communities of having prisons on their doorstep, in the sense of the jobs that are created, the stability of those jobs, the money that goes into the local community. Over £100 million of the monies that we've spent at Millsike have been spent on local companies within, I think, 25 miles or thereabouts of the sites. So there are huge benefits. I absolutely understand why some local communities, some individuals within communities might have questions about what it means to have a prison on their doorstep.
I concur with those remarks. My father's farm had a prison converted from an old RAF site in the 60s, and it's been very beneficial for the local economy. So I do concur with that. Luke Charteris.
How many prison places have been delayed due to nutrient neutrality rules?
I don't think I've got that number off the top of my head, but off the top of my head, we've got at least half a dozen projects that have had significant delays due to nutrient neutrality. I can do some maths while we
orient us for the time being. Perhaps you can write to the committee.
Absolutely. I'll try and do some maths while we get through the remainder as well.
You're perhaps suggesting that hundreds of prison places have been delayed due to neutrality.
100%, hundreds.
This is a very intractable problem, because if you're in somewhere like the Wye Valley, where nutrients are, a really important problem, so if you could let us have a note on this, I'll be very grateful. Thank you.
It's definitely hundreds. I'm just pausing on, is it 1,000 or more?
Thank you. Anna Dixon.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I'd like us to move us on to look at some of the effects of the prison capacity crisis, and I'd in particular like to start by considering the impact on prisoners and prisoner outcomes. So the report lays bare, and obviously we've also received quite a lot of evidence on this matter, that in particular overcrowding results in people often being confined for longer periods to their cells, restricting purposeful activity, which in itself then leads to higher rates of violence. So first of all, perhaps, Perm Secretary, from the sort of ministerial, from the ministry's side, what have you done to understand the impact of this current prison capacity crisis on prisoners and prisoner outcomes?
Okay, thank you. I mean, the first thing to say is that the situation, we as a ministry and as HMPPS have been doing absolutely everything possible in our power not to allow the system, the whole criminal justice system, to go into gridlock. And that has involved a massive amount of work in HMPPS and HMCTS, indeed with our colleagues such as the police, in order to have that happen, in order to prevent that from happening and to do that work, and ensuring nobody wants to run the system anywhere near the level it's been run. I mean, we've been running this system over 99% capacity. That is a testament, by the way, to the exceptional people who work in those prisons, and indeed, probation officers and others who have allowed that to continue. That is not a situation that anybody would have wanted. So first of all, may I reassure the committee that we have done absolutely everything we can, both to stop getting into that position and then to ensure that we got out of it as soon as we could. We're very well aware, I mean, you've already identified there's increased workload pressures on OMU staff, but also, prisoners held overnight in police cells. I mean, the pressures on police, but also pressures on prison officers. It also affects PECs, so the transport of those. It makes everything much more complicated and costly, moving those prisoners around. It's obviously not good for the prisoners. There's a with the regime, although Amy and her colleagues do everything possible not to allow it to affect regime, inevitably, the fact of a prison operating at capacity does impact on regime, and Amy's got to guard very carefully her own operational red lines to ensure that the safety and security of the prison, because the safety and security of staff and prisoners is absolutely paramount. So we've been putting that as the kind of number one priority, but therefore it affects rehabilitation outcomes. And I should also note it obviously significantly impacts on victims, because schemes such as SDS 40 are not what victims would want, and they're not necessarily, well, or ECSL indeed in the last government, and not what we would want either.
So I'll come back to staff and indeed, as you raise, public impacts of this capacity crisis. But if I may turn to you, Ms. Rees, I mean, what are you doing, given that you're running this hot, that there is this level of overcrowding, and it seems almost that this is like become your norm of how you're having to operate. What are you doing to sort of try and manage some of the harms we see, whether that's self-harm, prisoner-on-prisoner assault, in terms of both keeping the safety of prisoners, and we'll come on to some of the rehabilitation and purposeful activity stuff in a moment.
Of course, there's lots I'd like to say about this. The first is just to reiterate what the Perm-Sec said. Our staff have been exceptional right across HMPPS, and that is everyone from a prison officer to an OSG on the gate to probation officers to senior leadership. Absolutely outstanding in what has been too pressurised for too long. So that is the first point. The second is that we introduced red lines, which we have stuck by very rigidly, just for the benefit of the committee. Those 3 red lines are: 1, we would keep out at least 1,500 places to do the required fire maintenance, so we didn't go off schedule on that. 2, that any crowding would be dictated by us operationally in the normal way, which means we can't just do it the night before. It takes months to decide where it's safe, and we might come back to how we decide where it's safe to crowd. And 3, that we would safeguard operational stability. So if we couldn't staff the place to 75%, or indeed we were worried about the operational stability, as we were at times in Swaleside and Wood Hill, regardless of the position with prison places, we would take those places out of use, as we did do. So they're some of the first things that we did to ensure that there were red lines and we understood exactly what we were doing. The second is, you are absolutely right, that running at this level, and I might just put some flesh on the bone about what it means to run at this level of efficiency. We have something called an operating margin. That is an analytical exercise of the number of cells in our huge estate that you won't be able to access on any given day. And that's because they're in the wrong geography, because we have Cat C places, because they're specialist units where you can only put high security prisons or long-term high security estate. At the start of this, that margin was 1,850. Through the brilliant work of teams right across HMPPS and MOJ, we got that down to 1,190. So that means in a huge estate of our size, 88,000, there are only 1,190 places on average we're not accessing every day. That represents huge efficiency. What that means when we're running this late is that prisoners arrive too late with us, having been in court for too long. They often arrive in the wrong part of the estate, in the wrong part of the country, which doesn't just affect how late they arrive that night, it affects how early we can get them back to court in the next day, which in turn has a knock-on to things like Crown Court backlog, which I know that you've discussed a lot in this committee. So it's just a totally inefficient way to run the estate. There's definitely, in terms of our time, we spend so much time just managing what's come in very late at night and then very early in the morning trying to get them back out to court for longer journeys, meaning the time to do resettlement activity, the time to help people with the needs they've got is reduced. There's just no getting away from that. In terms of what we do to try and improve safety metrics all of the time, we've got a huge variety of things. Everything from what we do to try and prevent things coming in. Drones, I know, has been the subject of a lot of discussion. What we do in terms of airport-style security to stop prisoners, visitors, others bringing things in as we go. How we try to support both staff and prisoners who are struggling, what we've done on drugs, what we've done on accommodation. We try and do all of these things, but all of these things are a challenge before trying to run the estate at 99% occupancy.
So on one hand, you're saying that you're highly efficient because you're running at 99% and you've only got this small number of spare beds, but you're also admitting that in a sense it's very inefficient because trying to manage at that level of that tiny margin of cells and places means that effectively you're having to do things that are very inefficient, which impact the whole system and make the whole system inefficient, like transporting people to the other end of the country and back, and certainly have very poor outcomes on prisoners' ability to on release, get back into the community, have relationships and so on. So again, I just want to push a bit further on, I guess, what would you think would be an efficient operating, given that is almost too hot? What would allow you to actually do things and reduce sort of,
I never want to be above 95%.
Okay.
And ideally you'd get down to 90%. There's no question about that.
So 90%, what would that allow you to do in terms of improved prison
it would allow just more staff. It would allow more staff time. It would allow more efficient operating in terms of how we move around the country. It would allow us longer to do assessments. It would mean that people could be more efficiently placed to geographical parts in the country. So it would just allow a greater efficiency of outcome. If I may, I want to just touch on crowding because you mentioned that twice as well.
Yep.
In terms of how we assess crowding, that is an operational assessment done by my prison group directors. That's the equivalent of an area manager. It's an operational assessment. Most cells could physically take 2 people, but that's not what we just assess. We assess whether the ancillary services, the staffing, etc., will allow us safely to do that. Crowding levels at the moment are at 23.6%. So that means about a quarter of the estate are living in a cell designed for 1 with 2 people. To be clear to this committee, that means that someone has to defecate where someone else eats their meal. They were designed for 1 person. There is an open toilet in that cell.
A quarter of prisoners at the moment are living in those conditions.
Yeah, 23.6.
So is it your policy, Ms Rees, to move towards single cells everywhere?
Well, it's actually been our policy in new prisons to build places more designed for 2. So they have a separate bathroom, a separate shower, so that you can get good efficiency from the estate, but it doesn't have the problem that I just so graphically alluded to.
I hear your new estate, but is it clearly you're doing maintenance and refurbishments and one thing and another. Is it your stated policy that you are trying to move across your estate to single cell occupation?
We would always try to eliminate crowding, not necessarily single cell occupations though, because there's quite a lot of evidence that sharing for some people is very good protective factor for violence, self-harm, etc., but definitely to try and reduce crowding.
And can I just ask a follow-up in terms of the projections and assumptions? What assumptions did they make about the sort of 95%, 90% in terms of occupancy, and what assumptions they make in terms of crowding in terms of that 25%? So when you sort of did your projections about at what point supply and demand don't meet, have they built into them assumptions that you'll continue to run as hot as the current estate at 95% plus? And do they continue to assume that you will use crowding of a level of 25% of prisoners in unsuitable?
So Ross is the world's leading expert on projections, so
right.
I'm going to let him answer this, but just to say what they do build in. So the supply line essentially would include the operational margin and the buffer below which Amy, or rather above which Amy says within that supply, she cannot hold people. So that will be built into the supply line. The demand line is actually about what's coming in. So it's not so much built into the, it wouldn't be built into the demand projections in that way. But Ross will...
Yeah, so the supply line sets out the number of safely available places, which then goes through the sort of process that Amy has described. So that would include the provision of crowding. That doesn't, of course, mean that it commits us to using said crowding in the future, but that is what the projection does.
So what would you consider a safe level of crowding for your projections?
Well, I think there's 2 things, and my colleagues already talked about one of them. So HMPPS will not crowd where they regard it as unsafe, and there's very sort of strict operational red lines on that. There's a process for scrutinising it. Beyond that, there is a policy decision for ministers about what levels of crowding the government regards as acceptable in the estate. That has been quite long-standing now. Obviously,
at what level is it currently set?
Well, the figures you just
okay,
just
so
heard.
that is acceptable in terms of
to be really, that 23.6% is safe, otherwise I wouldn't sign it off.
Yes.
It's not optimal though.
No.
And it's important that these figures go quite a long way back now, so I don't think anyone is saying that levels of crowding in this state is desirable, but it's not something that has happened sort of recently. There have been modest changes in the projections, but it is included, it's in the supply line that we're talking about.
Okay, so I'd like to come on just to the impact of this in terms of rehabilitation. So back in 2020, Dame Carol Black produced a report about drug use specifically, and we've got evidence from both Her Majesty's Inspectorate and Cameras Limited, just really setting out still the scale of drug use in the prison population. I think random drug testing at the time of Dame Carroll's report was 15% of the prison population. And there does seem to be a link between this lack of purposeful activity and the hopelessness that engenders and use of drugs. We also received evidence that was very clear that the short sentencing, so 1 in 4 prisoners, I understand, are being detained because of an offence relating to their drug use, so it could be theft, and they tend to cycle in and out of prison, rarely getting the sort of long-term recovery or treatment that they need. So could you say, please, what are you doing to address both drug use in prisons and ensuring that there is access to effective drug treatment to try and reduce, again, on your demand side, the reoffending rates that are obviously so prevalent and obviously the public harm that causes?
Yeah, of course. And we've done 2 main things really since that time. One is we've tried to focus on continuity of treatment between what they get in prison and then what happens as they go out. Because actually there are quite good levels of treatment available in prisons. We work really closely with our NHS partners, but we often find that it's very difficult to keep that continuity of treatment as they go out into the community. So we've tried to do a lot. For example, we've got a system in Wales in Dyfodol where it's seamless, so you can access the same information both before they were in custody, while they were in custody, actually in the police custody suites and all the way through. That's something we've been really trying to work on. We've also tried to work on drug-free wings, so incentivised substance-free living units. We've got a variety of them. I recently spent a good chunk of time on one in Cardiff with the men who were on there. We think they really are a kind of good, effective way, particularly when they're in small specialist wings where people can access the treatment they need, etc. We're also, as we've talked about earlier, trying to prevent the drugs from getting in. So we try to do work. We've had quite considerable investment in terms of what we call airport security style security to try and prevent the drugs from getting in. But I do want to be candid in this committee that all of those efforts are not made easier by running at this level of population.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of policy, the drug rehabilitation requirements in terms of the sentencing review, is that something that's being looked at, that is a cost-effective alternative to these short custodial sentences? Is people who have known to have, drug use and be part of this cycling in and out, that there are alternatives?
Well, everything's in scope.
Yeah, as the committee will be aware, the scope of the centre review is quite broad, so they've been given the remit to look at a whole range of different options. Obviously, I don't think we can comment on whether they're looking at that specific thing. You'd have to ask David Gork, but the remit is wide.
Okay, and what progress has been made on implementing the Carol Black recommendations from 2020 in regard to sort of drug use in prisons?
Did you have particular recommendations in mind?
I mean, basically making sure that, there was drug treatment available. I mean, these sort of numbers of 15%, I don't think there's ever evidence we've had that these are going down.
So certainly where we have focused are the 2 areas since that report, so the continuity of treatment and trying to do the ISFLs. And particularly, I mean, without getting to loads of detail, random mandatory drug testing is a very small sample of any single prison population, and so you can easily have a skewed figure. What we've been trying to look at, as well as our MDT, is other things we can do, like wastewater testing, which doesn't give you an individual view of the prisoner, but it does tell you about drug use overall. It also tells you about trends in drug use, which that has been considerable in the last few years in terms of the change of drug use, and that's where drones has become a real issue, because it used to be that the product itself was highly valuable. Since we've moved to kind of new substances that can be synthetically produced, that it means that the product itself is less valuable, and they're prepared to take much riskier methods to get it into prison, because if you lose the product, it doesn't have the same impact. Yeah, spice and anything synthetically produced is just so much cheaper.
Okay, I think I have one final question, Chair, on this matter, which does come to education. So the links between getting education in prison as part of prisoner rehabilitation and reoffending, but also employment on release, there does seem to be evidence of that. We again received quite a lot of evidence that those educational facilities were in a state of decrepitude, if that's appropriate language to use. I mean, a very substandard physical. So what are you doing to try and secure both the physical facilities as well as releasing people to give them time to go to education? I mean, what proportion of your prisoners would be able to access education at the moment?
So there's a few things. First of all, for education or anything else in purposeful activity, you need to run a really good regime, which means some of the stuff we've talked about now in terms of you've got to be able to unlock everyone on time and know you're having, and prisoners got to be in the appropriate establishment. Then you've got to have good staffing levels. Really pleased to say we've now got 99.5% of our required operational staffing in place. That's the first platform. Then we need to have really good relationships with our education suppliers. So once you've got the prison there, you've got high quality education, and ensure that those places are filled. We've been doing loads of work. You might be aware, but we started employing about 2 years ago specialists with an education background to come and look particularly directly employed by the prison about what they could do. Spent a good time with one in Brixton recently. Spoke to Charlie Taylor, Chief Inspector of Prisons. He really thinks those individuals have added a lot in terms of what we do, in terms of education and the quality of education on offer for prisoners. But as you can appreciate, not all prisoners want to go into education. So we would normally have a proportion of places that are available that would be somewhere between a quarter and a fifth of prisoners who want to access it, and not all full-time. We often struggle to fill those education places, so we need to try and make them exciting for prisoners and something that they want to attend and they want to go to. But we are starting to get improved outcomes from those regimes in terms of maths and basic English standards that they're achieving. And certainly when I met with Charlie Taylor recently, he thinks our purposeful activity scores are now beginning to start to go in the right direction and showing some improvements.
The bottom line on all of this is that the current crisis in capacity that has been the main is having a negative impact on ability to get into drug rehab, ability to educate, ability to actually reduce reoffending rates by giving people purposeful activity.
In straightforward terms, it means all of our resources are stretched over more people with less time.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, this is a really important question, isn't it? When recidivism is, in some cases, 50%, if you could even make a dent in that, you would reduce the amount of crime and reduce the amount of prison spaces required. It's not just education, it's giving prisoners a purposeful use of their time rather than locking them up in cells for 22 hours a day, as the report makes clear. Is this something that in prison strategy you are seriously looking at? Because it does seem to me that it would be a lot to be gained from improvements in these aspects.
So yes, I mean reducing the offending is the number one, alongside protecting the public and swift access to justice, raison d'etre for the department. Obviously in SR21 we received 550 million over 3 years to support reducing the offending, looking at things like getting into a job, getting accommodation and substance misuse. So it's a combination. I mean, as Amy has said, where we are at the moment in terms of capacity has definitely had negative repercussions for our ability to rehabilitate, but it is an area where funding matters, and we're keen to work out how we can maximise funding available to help rehabilitate prisoners, because it is so essential and it's the only way you break the cycle. Do you want to add anything?
Well, just that I think the further ahead we can plan for these things, the more likely we are to have kind of programs that will succeed. So I think that the approach that we're taking to sort of setting out a long-term strategy that you heard about earlier should help as well.
Thank you. I'm going to call... she's gone. Right. I'm now going to take a short break. And we will return in 5 minutes. The clock shows us it's 10:48. If we could return about sort of 10:55, something like that would be really good.
48.
48. I said 48. We come to Rebecca Paul, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being back with us. It's really nice to see you again, Dame Antonia. I wanted to move on and talk a little bit about the capacity shortfall numbers. And I was actually hoping you could help me to understand the numbers in the first instance, because I think that would be really helpful for the committee. So I can see from paragraph 3.5 in the NAO report that by the end of 2027, there is a projected shortfall of approximately, and there's three versions of this, but in the low population scenario, 2,100 places, in the central scenario, 12,400 places, and in the high scenario, 21,200 places. Now, my understanding from the assumptions around that is that that excludes the impact of SDS 40, which is obviously the early release scheme that was launched, I think it was September last year. I just wanted to understand, so in terms of the numbers that are included in the Ministry of Justice annual statement, obviously there are different projections, but I think that's because there are different assumptions. And my understanding is it's because SDS 40 is probably one of those differences. So there's a number of 5,400 projected as the capacity shortfall. So is that in line with your understanding? So say the 12,400 is excluding SDS 40, 5,400 including SDS 40?
Yes, roughly. So there might be some other changes as well. So when we publish data, we obviously have to publish the most up-to-date data and the most accurate data as we have it. So when we published in December the annual capacity statement, those numbers are based on the latest, most accurate data. So they included predictions, the projected line, which included SDS 40, for example. Yeah. The NAO, at the time they produced their report, also in December, I think wanted to keep working with the original data that they had, and at the time we all discussed this, and they understood that it wasn't therefore up-to-date and accurate and wouldn't match what we were publishing, but was based on the data that they had previously been working with, which is why their number says, I think for Central, 12,000, and we project it as being about half that. Ours are based on what was the latest data, most accurate data, with all the implemented policies at the time. So, okay. I would go with the capacity with as it were, Gauss agreement. I go with capacity for the latest numbers on this.
Yes, the 5,400. No, that's really, really helpful, and thank you. So, effectively, the SDS 40 and some of the other measures are reducing the shortfall in capacity by about 7,000, sort of roughly.
Roughly, which is, of course, one of the principal reasons for doing it. I mean, the reason that the government took the decision to do it was to stop the lines crossing when they were about to cross before, but also it does help in the future.
No, absolutely. And do you have any thoughts on how long SDS 40 is going to need to continue in order to allow you to manage the very challenging situation that you have at the moment?
So obviously, as I already set out, the line includes it in perpetuity because, in line with best practice, you work on the basis of the policy that is in place. Government could decide, following, say, the outcome of the sentencing review, if it puts other measures in place, to unwind SDS 40. That could be a policy decision that could be made. It hasn't yet been made, which is why, at the moment, the numbers include it. I wouldn't want to prejudge what ministers would decide on that policy. I mean, it'll depend on a number of things, not least, no doubt, what comes out of the sentencing review, and therefore what policy decisions the government makes to reduce demand.
And then totally agree with that. In addition to that, as you'll be aware, the Lord Chancellor has agreed there'll be a review no later than after 18 months of implementation to see how the policy is developing.
Right. No, that's helpful. Thank you. And just linking back to obviously the previous hearing we had where we talked about the significant remand population. So, and the number you gave us at that hearing, I think was 17,600. So it's actually 20% of the prison population. So not going to obviously go over old ground that we went over before. But I'm sort of interested in some of the comments that were made by the Lady Chief Justice, Baroness Carr of Walton on the Hill, around the capacity in the courts to sit. So obviously capacity is, I think, 113,000 days, and a decision was made by government to only move to 106,500, leaving 6,500 days unfilled. And I'm just interested whether or not, this obviously is going to have a drastic effect and put pressure into the system. And have you considered what the impact would be on the capacity shortfall numbers if there were actually more sitting court days? Have you thought through that process in terms of if you did get your maximum, what would that mean for the capacity shortfall, and would that relieve the pressure on temporary schemes like SDS 40?
So there's, as it's ever a very complex system. Yes is the short answer. I should just to be clear, the agreement reached between the LCJ and the previous Lord Chancellor was for 106,000 days, sitting days to be sat. You referred to a reduction or something. The agreement reached was for 106,000. The Lord Chancellor has now increased it to 108,500. So there wasn't a reduction.
No, it went up, but just not to the maximum.
It went up, but not to
113,000, which is the maximum.
One of those reasons, although not wanting to get diverted onto my other favourite topic, which is Crown Court backlogs, one of the reasons for that, of course, is there's the maximum that can be sat by the judiciary, and then there's the maximum that can be sat for other constraints on the system, as we discussed last time I was here. To your main point, Ms. Wall, you are absolutely right. The whole thing is a system. So it is difficult to bring down the outstanding caseload in the Crown Court if you don't have space in the prisons in order to allow that churn through. Equally, as we discussed last time, the problem with an increasing backlog in the Crown Court is it creates a much bigger problem for Amy and her colleagues because it has increased numbers on remand, which make it now to 17,000 from 9,000 in 2019, I think it was, in a way that makes it much harder for Amy to manage the prison population. So you're right that actually there is a virtuous cycle one could get into, and we are on our way to getting there, because the first thing you have to do is create headroom in the prison population in order, as we have now done with SDS 40, in order to bring down the Crown Court backlog, which we are seeking to do, e.g. through magistrate sentencing powers, because you need that headroom to allow you to do that. And then overall, as you bring down that backlog, that should then help you with remand. So over time, you move towards a more sustainable criminal justice system as a whole. So to a long way of answering your question, do we consider the impact of one on the other? Absolutely, yes. And on almost all the governance we have in place in the custodial options task force, on the criminal justice action group, it includes both HMPPS, HMCTS, but also the police. So every part of the system, we're looking at the whole thing end to end and working out what is optimal for the whole system.
Do you mind if I just had a word on remand, though? Because you raise a very important point, because pretty much all the way through this hearing so far, we've talked about total prison numbers, and I wish it was only that straightforward for me, because total prison numbers are not just what I have to manage. I also have to manage a geographical constraint. So if I had a prisoner that was sentenced in Exeter, Crown Court, and I've got a place in Leeds, that's really no use to me, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And equally, and the point that you're really referring to in remand is if they're on remand, the very difficulty I've got in accessing efficiently the estate is they need to stay next to the local court where they're going to be heard. So these things provide very particular pressures, and it is that bit of the estate, it is our reception estate that has been under the most acute pressures.
No, absolutely, and I can fully appreciate the challenges you're under with that, because as I sort of said at the beginning, it is 20% of the population are on remand, which I think, that is a really, really difficult thing to manage. I appreciate you obviously didn't make the decisions around the court sitting days, but I am interested in if the courts were sitting for 100 and...
I'm not keen to go too far down this line, because it is outside the
what
scope
would
of
the
this
capacity
inquiry.
shortfall would be. But in terms of understanding the capacity shortfall, I think it is relevant.
Right, okay, just on this one.
Just, and obviously I don't expect you to have that number to hand, but...
I'm not sure I've understood exactly your question. When the system was running at 99+% capacity, at that moment, increasing sitting days would have meant the CGS would have gone into gridlock.
Yeah.
I don't understand. I think if you have understood it to be that in a rationed system, you can't necessarily bring one number down and assume it's going to bring the other down, because if it's full, you actually can't allow the increase in demand to happen.
So you wouldn't want the court sitting days to go up to 113,000, is what you're saying? That wouldn't work. That doesn't help.
No, that's not. I mean, that's not quite right. And I also want to be very careful, because when we were considering, when the former Lord Chancellor was doing the Concordat letter a year ago with the Lady Chief Justice, the agreement for 106,000 sitting days was what at the time was thought to be the maximum that could be sat. Now, as it turns out, things changed during the course of the year. But I think if you have understood that bringing down the backlog automatically leads to bringing down the prison population, that's not quite right when you're operating in a full capacity.
No, I think I'm sort of trying to understand if you moved to the amount of sitting days that's optimal, and is that more than what we are currently sitting? I guess that's the question, because you sort of said at the time it was 106.
That was what was agreed. That was what was agreed in the Concordat letter between the Lady Chief Justice and the Lord Chancellor. So I'm just setting out the agreement.
In addition to what the Home Secretary said, I don't think there is a single answer to that question of optimal, and it will depend. Obviously that's not the reason we do court sitting days, and it's separately constitutionally governed anyway. But it'll depend on the balance between the remand population, the sentence population, the balance between Crown Courts and Magistrates Courts. So I think you'd find a different answer in lots of different dates if you ask that question anyway. Okay,
no, look, thank you, and it's interesting to get a different perspective, because obviously, there has been evidence given recently at another select committee on this. So thank you for that, but I won't labour the point, and I will move on. Obviously, appreciate that you've had to use various emergency measures. So, you've brought in Operation Safeguard, Operation Early Dawn in order to manage the challenging situation that you have. How much extra has it cost for you to put that in place in light of the expansion scheme running late?
Well, I'll say a few things, and then Amy will want to comment. Operation Safeguard. So all these different operations are different types of things. Yeah. Operation Safeguard in particular, which is the use of police cells, has cost £70 million. That was we've authorised at every stage both the spend and the volume of cells used. So there's a very specific process that we go through to authorise cell use of Safeguard, and that's signed off by me and by ministers. And that's been a total amount there. We're very conscious, and we go through a number of gateways, and every time we want to increase the number of cells or we want to reactivate, then we go through that process again.
Worth me just adding operationally, if I may, just quickly on Safeguard. First of all, I'm extremely grateful to police colleagues who've made Safeguard available. It has been an absolutely critical part of our contingency planning. Second is that Safeguard doesn't provide any cells. What it provides is liquidity in the system, meaning that on the night where, example I've used, someone gets sentenced next time, might have spaces but they're in Leeds, I simply cannot get that person from Exeter to Leeds overnight, or whatever the case may be. And so Safeguard has been a very important one-night contingency that has allowed, like I say, it's not really additional places, because the following morning we have to get them out of Safeguard and back into prison custody. It's allowed us to move the pieces around the chessboard that once you get into 99% occupancy, it's very difficult to move it very efficiently.
Thank you. I think I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much,
Thank you so much.
Rebecca Paul. Luke Charteris, please.
Thank you. Just a quick fire. Initially, how many of these rapid deployment cells from tranches 1 and 2 have been delivered?
770.
Okay, and that's taken 5 years, 4 years roughly so far, hasn't it? The inception of the idea.
From the very start of the programme, in the sense of conversation about rapid deployment cells to today, yes, that's 4 years. Sure. Each project has not taken 4 years.
And my thesis really is, of course, in totality, 4 years to get to 700 doesn't sound very rapid. It sounds more like really slow deployment cells, and project speed sounds like project slow. So in this overall operating environment, were you, Permanent Secretary, coming up with other contingency plans that you could present to ministers, knowing actually that the rapid deployment cells programme was actually the very opposite.
So, yes, as evidenced by the fact that the criminal justice system did not go bust. So the period leading up to, first of all, October 23, when the previous government took the decision about end of custody supervised licence, was a series of interventions in order to prevent the system reaching gridlock, and then indeed again up to the point where this government took the decision on SDS 40. So there's been a huge number of things, both policy changes and supply things. On the rapid deployment cells, I would say that the point about, they were entirely innovative when first identified, and I completely accept your perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek suggestion that they're not that rapid. But I actually think one of the things about them actually was that when we were first coming up with, when we were first talking to the market about them, one of the reasons they ended up being delayed or coming in later than we wanted was because we weren't doing like intrusive site assessments at the time we were doing the design, but we were literally in the process of working out what the design would look like and whether we were doing testing as to what category they could hold. And I do really believe that at some point they will be potentially game-changing because of they will end up being able to be brought on rapidly. And as Amy says, it's actually really good quality accommodation. So I feel like sometimes you've got to take a bit longer to get the thing that you can then will give you significant flexibility.
Do you think maybe with the benefit of hindsight there was too much emphasis on them being a silver bullet earlier on in sort of 21, 22?
Possibly. I think it was... I myself was quite excited about them when I arrived in this job in January 21 because they seemed to be something significantly different from what we had previously done, and we're always looking at ways to do something that is innovative. And even at the time, we knew that there was uncertainty. Obviously, there was risk. We didn't know what the cohort would be, whether we would be. For example, would we be able to get something that felt like a rapid deployment cell that could hold Cat B? For example, all those things, all this stuff had to be tested. Where could they be? How could they be brought in? Were they, would you stack them? Would you not stack them? So there was probably some. They were ambitious. They were at the time ambitious and
a bit too ambitious.
I guess the question, can you be too ambitious? Like maybe. They didn't, but they will. Don't forget, they will end up delivering 1,800 nearly places. And they have already delivered 770 places, and in the future they could easily end up delivering more. So I still think they're like a really big... they're the biggest change in terms of accommodation we have brought on and been able to provide that's happened in the last, 5-10 years. So, I'm going to say 5 years. And now Amy's going to tell me I'm wrong about that.
No, not wrong at all. But, just to say, it's not just the sum total, the nearly 1,800 places. It's that they provide places in corners of the estate that we would otherwise find it very difficult and for very certain prisoners to access. The other thing, it just seems to me, the basis of both your first questions and these questions are implementation times, because in the end, whether it's new supply or ECSL or anything, I have to implement it, and all of these things have different implementation times, with a brand new prison probably being at the extreme end and ECSL being at the extreme opposite end. And so that's why both the PermSec and Ross's comments are so important. The thing we need to do is try and project outwards so you can work out exactly which one of these things with what implementation window you want to implement. They do all actually provide something slightly different.
I shift here, if I may, Chair, to my next set of questions from the supply side onto the demand side and the sentencing review. I'm sort of slightly worried that we're going to have the sentencing review and it's going to support some of the projected shortfalls, wherever the ministerial decisions land. But could you help set out some of the risks that it may be almost too late? Because of the course, there will be a lag and a lead time into some of the benefits you get in managing that demand side. So could you talk through some of the risks that we might not actually get there quick enough?
Yeah, great. I'm going to ask Ross as DG Policy to start on this. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think we're planning for that very carefully. There's a reason why the sentencing review is happening on the timescale it is to make sure that the decisions are available to ministers, and then, of course, if legislation follows, that will need to come to Parliament. So we've been considering that very carefully. Of course, it's not the only thing that we're doing. So, as was set out in the annual statement, ministers have also authorised, and indeed now Parliament has granted, some additional measures on HDC, on RAR as well. So it's going to need a portfolio of different things. Actually, going back to your last question, I think the same was true with RDCs. We didn't just rely on RDCs. The previous government did demand-side measures as well. So I totally agree. There'll need to be a whole set of different measures. I don't think it's the case that the timeline is impossible in the sentencing review.
One of my colleagues might come on to some of this in a moment. So if I just end my little cluster of questions, wrapping together supply and demand, they've got interactive effects, and perhaps Ms. Rees, I think you've given some really illuminating answers so far. You could help sort of unpack some of this, which is to say, when prisoners have time in custody, hopefully they're undertaking meaningful rehabilitation and so on. So where you're reducing time in prison, are you doing the analysis as a department to actually understand that might lead to increased pressure and increased demand through heightened reoffending because of the very consequence that they've had a shortened period in prison? So could you give some reassurance that you're almost coming up with that systems level interactive thinking that reduced time in prison may actually yield increased demand?
I think I'd start at the opposite end of the telescope, though. I think what we are absolutely clear about, and there's loads of evidence, is that when you disrupt people for a very short prison sentence and you lose their ties to accommodation, to employment, to family ties, that is the worst outcome of all. So it is certainly true that when we have prisoners for much longer periods of time, we can do more effective work with them, and actually the outcomes are better in terms of when we have them for longer periods. But if you're looking at anything under 12 months, the disruption effect in terms of the links for resettlement back to what people need, jobs, family relationships, accommodation, very, very poor outcomes because you disrupt all of that.
But also I think if one of the points behind your question, Mr. Charteris, is what do we understand that having fewer people in prison will lead to an additional burden elsewhere in the system? The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, we talk about this a lot. Amy never lets me forget that actually probation, I mean, if anything, the impact on probation is, it's significant, but also rising and will significantly increase if we attempt to drive down the prison population through decisions that ministers may or may not make in the future.
Absolutely, and it's not just probation, it's all the other services, it's health, etc., all the other people that need to pick those up. But it is certainly true with all of those other community services. Had we kept them in the community and they keep the link to those services in the first place, it would be much better than trying to manage their move into custody and then in a very short period they move back out of custody into the community.
I'm slightly worried that we'll have the sentencing review, but then actually we won't necessarily think about some of the resource requirements for the probation service as well.
Yeah, so a key part of our planning is to, not just for the sentencing review, but for any demand measure and any supply measure, is to look ahead for the staffing requirements of that. It's part of the modelling that we do, and there's a governance structure that the NAO commented on that helps check all that is in place.
It's also certainly true, just on probation, to be clear and candid, that we will need to take some decisions. Should the outcome of the sentencing review be that we're going to put more volume into probation, we'll need to take some decisions about what they're going to prioritise, because it isn't possible for them to manage an increased workload beyond where they are at the moment.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think we're getting the message that the system is dynamic, and we got that at the last hearing on the course backlog as well. But I think you're on record as saying that the concrete measures, such as increasing the number of prison cells, on its own won't resolve the issue. Other issues, such as reducing recidivism, are long-term strategies. So aren't you letting the prospective policy changes doing quite a lot of heavy lifting here? So the sentencing review, the criminal courts review. And given you said previously that you assume government policy stays the same until it changes, what are you actually doing to anticipate those reviews in terms of the effects on prison numbers?
So, I mean, the first thing it's not so much that we assume that policy, the government policy stays the same. It's more that I was just explaining that when we publish projections, we publish on the basis of known variables, so policies that have already been implemented, and we project on that basis. Obviously, there is, as the annual capacity document shows, there is a gap projected in the future between supply and demand, and one of the reasons that the government has asked David Gauke to lead this independent review, the sentencing review, is to look at a number of issues in sentencing, and one of the reasons to do that would be to want to have a sustainable system. So something is going to have to happen, and to your point, we're building what we're building, and that is also public. Other things have already been done. I mean, we constantly consider a large number of options that we would put to ministers to solve these problems, as we have done, and as you've noted, as has been done over recent years. In last October, the government announced an extension of the curfew for HDC from 6 to 12 months. And there's also the risk-adjusted, what's RAR stand for? Risk-adjusted recall review. So there's a number of other policies that are already coming down the track to help focus on that.
And there's SDS 40. There are. Well, my point is that these things, even in combination, are not resolving the crisis. You presumably are not allowed to put figures in that say, well, we hope to reduce recidivism by 10% over the next 10 years, so we'll account for that.
Also, it's not that we wouldn't be allowed to; it's that I wouldn't let that happen, because you wouldn't. The project you couldn't, so unless you could guarantee you could deliver it, then the projections weren't going to be able to be accurate.
Given we've been told that both of the major reviews are reporting in the spring, which seems very quick, but there could be legislative implications of them. Certainly, it will take time to introduce the measures they suggest, and you don't know. You might suspect, but you don't know what the measures are going to come in. What planning are you able to do, and where can we see the results of that planning? Because this seems to be absolutely axiomatic as to whether you're going to succeed in reducing the prison overcrowding situation.
Well, as we were discussing earlier, the capacity gap numbers have already come down significantly from those that were included in the NAO report. The current government's taken action that has reduced that substantially. We do look ahead and we plan very carefully for measures that come in. Obviously, we can't plan for the measures of the sentencing review until they are finalised and it's independent. There's obviously a mix of secondary and primary levers. So, as you'd be aware, some of the secondary legislation measures can come in more quickly than primary legislation would, and there might be other kind of policy options that the government wishes to consider as well. So, I suppose, as the Lord Chancellor makes clear in the introduction to the capacity strategy, in totality, all these measures will come together. I think we are confident in our planning systems can support that. We'll need to wait for the policy decisions from ministers after the sentencing review.
And again, what planning are you doing for additional costs it might be?
Yes, so whenever we put forward a policy measure, we set out the cost. Very often it's done in the impact assessment, as was the case with HDC recently. It will be part of the planning. You've heard we look at the operational impacts, we look at the staffing impacts, we look at the impacts on our CGS partners. So I think there's a thorough and extensive process. I'm not suggesting any of that's easy, but I think we do have very well-developed processes in place to do that.
When do we get to hear about that? Because, presumably you're in a fairly constant narrative with the Gauke review, for example, because you wouldn't want them to be presumably coming out with recommendations that would increase the prison population. So if that dialogue is going on, will anything be published prior to the sentencing review reporting?
Well, it's an independent review. I think we will have to wait to see what the review says, and then ministers will have to decide what they want to do about it. And then, in turn, if it's legislation, Parliament will need to decide whether it grants those powers. So there's a whole series of steps to go through. The planning will be taking place, and it will be very thorough, and we'll check all the things you just described.
The last question on this issue: Are there any? Use the example of Dartmoor, for example, which is closed as we speak. I don't know whether you have a prospective reopening date. Have you got any other situations like that, or potential situations where substantial numbers, not game-changing perhaps, but substantial numbers of prison places could go offline or come back online in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, it can always happen. Go on, Amy.
Well, I'm afraid there are a variety of operational reasons why these things might happen. Everything from rack, which we didn't experience, so we've still got 183 places off for rack at the moment in 2 establishments in the estate. Just a boiler or a leak or a fire, touch wood, any of those could bring off substantial numbers. And in terms of Dartmoor, as you say, they're quite significant numbers, but we would need to find a solution, a technical solution that means we were safe to reopen them.
And what's the position with Dartmoor?
So the position at the moment is that we are still looking with HSE about what we could do, what mechanical, ventilation, etc., that we could introduce that would allow us to safely reopen it.
You're paying a lot of money for it, aren't you? I think the Duchy of Cornwall, is it? Or to...
We certainly pay rent, yeah.
Duchy of Cornwall. And are there other prisons? I mean, they're not just in terms of their physical state. But there are a lot of prisons in crisis at the moment. And one of the solutions to that might be to close a wing or to redistribute prisoners in some way, which again, that has big operational effects and could temporarily at least reduce the number of available places. Anything like that going on?
Yep, there absolutely are. So back to my red lines, we took places off even when we were at our most capacity constrained, where we thought we were unsafe or we needed to. More recent example is Wandsworth, where we have taken places offline to try and reduce the operational burdens. We've done 150 so far.
150 cells, is that?
Places.
Of how many places in the whole prison?
So the OPCAP varies, but circa 1,500 in Wandsworth, and we tried to reduce those.
When did that happen? When were those 10%?
So we started taking them off in kind of late autumn last year.
Right. And no plans to reintroduce them.
No,
so that's running at 90% of its previous capacity.
Yeah, we've tried to the conversations we had earlier, what we tried to do is reduce crowding in Wandsworth to try and relieve the pressure there, given they have operational difficulties. So in answer to your question, yes, for staffing reasons, for stability reasons, we will take places offline if we need to.
Thank you. I had some questions on probation. Shall I keep them for later?
No, do them now if you wish to, please, Andy.
I raise it now because you just alluded to the implications for other parts of the system. I mean, I went with the Justice Committee up to Manchester to look at the prison, Buckley Hall, which I'm sure you know, and I'm sure nothing gets past the officials, and also to talk to Greater Manchester Probation Service. And although prison officer numbers have increased, undoubtedly, and there are still a lot of gaps in the probation system as it is. There are a lot of additional pressures. For example, they will cope with pressures due to rioting. They will cope with other pressures as we go along. There is a shortage of officers. When they start, they will not be experienced officers.
Sorry, are we talking about? Can you clarify?
Probation
officer rather than prison officers.
Yes. In some ways, the situation seems to be more acute with probation officers in terms of that recruitment process. And we know there are a lot of risks. There are serious further offence risks that probation service is understandably cautious about. What's your feeling overall about the probation service's ability to cope now, but also if you're going to put all these additional pressures on them, whether that's by home release or whether it's by non-custodial sentences?
So I'm going to ask Amy, who's also responsible for the probation service, to talk to this. But I would say that, first of all, they are under a huge amount of pressure at the moment. They're doing an absolutely excellent job. We're very conscious of a lot of the changes that we make when we are diverting, be it HDC, be it risk assessment, recall review, a lot of things lead to increased pressure on probation, which is why we've got a big programme of recruitment in place, which Amy's overseeing. So I'll ask her to say something.
A couple of things, if I may, and then I will get to your question. I'd like to do some positives. So first of all, you started with prison staff. We are at 99.5% now in terms of prison staff. That has been a huge effort, and we're really proud of everyone's successes. It is worth saying, though, even on the prison side, that now means nearly 40% of our band 3 to 5 prison officers have less than 3 years' experience, and that is something we'll need to manage through the estate. In terms of probation, we've increased staffing by 20% since we took it over and unified it, and we've recruited over 4,500 PQIPs, so that's people to trainee probation officers. But I absolutely accept the premise of your question. To be clear, we cannot put any additional pressure on probation without an offsetting measure, and recruitment alone will not be sufficient. So whilst we've been successful in recruitment, it will not be sufficient. What we are doing and what we already started to do is, as these new measures, as the PermSec says, as they come in, so things like the changes we've already made to HDC, etc., SDS 40 means people are spending longer balance of the time in probation. We have started to do what we've called a programme called Probation Reset, where what we are attempting to do is to say, look, focus your efforts first of all on medium and high risk prisoners as opposed to the lower risk offenders, and second of all the evidence says that the first 2/3 of the licence are the time when we will have the most impact on the risk reduction. So focusing the effort on the first 2/3. I'm pleased to say we think that has been successful, and that on the lower tiers we've managed to have a really significant percentage reduction, and actually on the higher tiers we've had a 10% increase of the time that probation professionals are spending with them. That's exactly the sort of change we were seeking to pull off.
You're constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul here, aren't you? What's your equivalent to the 99% figure for probation? If you've got 99% filled places, that is, with filled establishment for prison officers, what is it for probation?
Well, so it varies by the different staff grades in probation, so it's quite complicated because some cases can be overseen by PSAs.
Probation officers and PSAs.
Probation officers,
yeah.
We're probably at about 102% overall in terms of the workload that they are managing at the moment. That will be a wide variation, so some probation officers will be way under that, some probations will be over it. In terms of robbing Peter to pay Paul, that genuinely isn't quite the way I'd characterise it, because what we're doing in Reset is saying there are some things that there is not the evidence it's worth us pursuing doing anymore. So there's actually some things we're attempting to stop. So it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's saying Peter won't do some things, Paul will do some other things. So we are trying to say there has got to be a principle, to your point, that we cannot put any additional work onto probation without trying to establish what probation won't be doing going forward and where we would like to focus their efforts.
Those less serious, perhaps less dangerous less serious offenders, less dangerous offenders,
yeah.
Aren't those exactly the type of offender who, if court review recommends alternative to custody, there's going to be a flood more of coming out? And the expectation among everyone from the public to sentencers is going to be that they have a high degree of supervision and they have what are testing and meaningful alternatives to custody. And you're saying, well, we don't have time to look after them.
No, two things about that aren't quite accurate. The first is that the lowest rung of probation caseload are people who would never go into prison. So these are people who receive only community sentences. They might only receive a standalone unpaid work order. So this is at the very bottom of the caseload.
Sorry, that's my point. Or it's another side of the same coin, which is we hear from, say, magistrates that they are reluctant to sentence for community sentences for the very reason that they think people are going to have a soft ride, not be supervised, and get away with murder. Well, murder also.
Well, a couple of things about that. First of all, what the evidence base would say is that what those people need at the very lower end is they need more support, but there's no evidence that lots of intensive supervision is very helpful for those people. What often those people need is support to the kind of services we were talking about before, so accommodation, etc. Yes, a level of supervision, but the question is for how long and for what duration is actually helpful, and what support services are you going to move them on to. But actually, in terms of the people you're talking about shifting from short custody and into instead in probation, they are not the bottom end of the tier. Like there are people who will need more support from probation and supervision from qualified probation officers, which is why we must make capacity for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but you take. I'll stop here because I'm actually very sympathetic to the situation you're in. I just can't see the way out of it. But if I were a magistrate sentencing and it was on the cusp and I was deciding between a short custodial and community centres, which I may not even have the choice of in a short time, and I asked questions about what the nature of that community punishment would be, and I wasn't satisfied that it would be in any way either rigorous or take place at all, and therefore I go for a custodial option. Aren't you concerned about that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but that's what I'm saying the remedy is. The remedy is to make capacity for exactly those people who are not at the lowest end of the tier. and instead look at the ones who would not ever be a choice for custody. These are not people that would ever have been referred to custody. They are people who just get a community sentence. The choice is, what do we do with them as part of that community sentence in order to make capacity for the very cusp people you're talking about?
Can I just briefly add one quick point about technology, which is, of course, things like tagging can make a significant difference in terms of when what one can do as an option of what one can do when sentencing. So obviously, sentencing massively independent judiciary, but knowing that things like tags work, and also the technological change on things like GPS tags and sobriety tags, I think have made a difference in terms of the attractiveness as a sentencing option of of electronic monitoring as opposed to custody.
And do they require any supervision or monitoring other than the purely electronic for the person serving that sentence, which again may be either an alternative or early release from custody? And do you have confidence in the companies who are Serco is one springs to mind, who are running those?
Well, I've opened up a whole can of worms here, but yes, I mean,
Certainly
I think the short answer is yes, and I mean Jim is the world's leading expert on this, but I think the point I'm making is it does tag as well as whatever would have gone alongside it is at least as good as whatever would have gone alongside it, so it can provide an additional level of confidence.
So as an example of that kind of supervision, we've introduced a couple of years ago what we call the acquisitive crime pilots in electronic monitoring. So 19 of the police forces across England and Wales, individuals released from prison having served time for burglary or robbery and a few other offences, by mandate they get a GPS tag on their leg. We supervise them, but in addition, we receive data from those police forces on robberies, burglaries, other linked crimes on their patch. We match that with the GPS data coming off the legs of those offenders. We use that to rule people in and out of being suspects of crime. It's also really powerful because it gives additional information for the probation officer to use in their supervisory conversations with those individuals. So it's exactly the kind of innovative use of technology alongside practitioner judgment that we would want to see more of in the future, and I think it's the kind of thing that absolutely looks and feels and demonstrates the kind of toughness of probation when that's the right response for certain individuals. On Serco and Allied, who are the other company who provide the tags, so it's absolutely right that there have been transitional challenges as they've moved from the old systems, IT systems that they inherited, to the new systems that they're introducing. We're a long way through that now. There's been very close scrutiny of their performance. Amy and others included, we're hopeful that we'll have completed, or rather they will have completed, transition to those new systems in the next couple of months. That then provides a really strong platform upon which to build.
Just a couple of other points on tech, if I may, just to answer your question directly. It's not a free good, even when these systems are working perfectly, because even if someone's tagged, you need a responsible officer. So you need probation officer capacity in order to do whatever's needed with the data that comes through. So we will definitely factor that into Ross's point to all future projections. And more broadly, we joked earlier about AI being the answer to all issues. I'm not saying it is something on its own that will help us, but one of the things we do need to do for probation officers as well is provide them with the best possible tech to try and reduce the amount of double keying and things that they have to do to mean that their time is most efficiently spent. And we do think there is some good work to be done there too.
Thank you very much. Very good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter, and thank you for those answers. We did a lot of work in the last Parliament on this committee on tagging, so that was a very useful update. Mr. Slaughter mentioned HMP Dartmoor. Now, I reckon that the costs of remediating are probably fairly substantial. When you renewed the lease last year, I hope you managed to reduce the cost of that lease considerably.
Well, we certainly did some good negotiations with the lease, and we also got some investment from the Duchy into things that we could do in the prison. It is certainly true from what we know today, and there is more we need to do to work out exactly what we're going to do on Dartmoor, that it would require significant investment, but it would also be a lot less than building a brand new prison of that size, 640 places. The question for us is, can we find a technical solution that means it is safe for prisoners and staff to go and work there to reduce the levels of radon?
So is there a risk that further parts of the prison may have to be closed yet?
There is no part of the prison in use at the moment.
None at all?
No,
I think that Luke Charteris has got a follow-up on this.
Do you think it's fair to taxpayers that we're still paying rent to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Cornwall for the premises, given the radon issues? Is it fair to my constituents and other constituents?
And the fact that it's unusable now.
The thing is, we haven't made the determination on whether it's unusable. What we're trying to do is find a technical solution. And if you're asking me honestly, straightforwardly, would I want to give up Dartmoor as a site right now? The answer is a resolute no. Because if I can make it work...
The Chancellor of the Duchy of Cornwall
Well, I mean, it's got to say according to the contract, right? Yeah. I mean, I think it's...
I'm not asking about contractual fairness. I'm asking for the sense of value for money to our taxpayers.
I'm still occupying it.
I think to be fair to our witnesses, that's out with their scope at the moment. Clive bets on.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Just to follow up there, though, but did you not think about inserting a clause into the contract when you negotiated it, which indicated that there would be a reduced payment if the prison was taken completely out of service or partially out of service because of radon, given that radon was a known problem when the contract was entered into?
Just to be fair, before we get too far into contracts and payments, in order to try and find it, first of all, I've been clear, I wouldn't want to give up Dartmoor as a site. It's 640 places if we can find a solution. The second is that we're still in there at the moment. We haven't got prisoners in there, but we've got staff in there and we've got lots of work. We're trying to figure out if we can find a technical solution. So I wouldn't want to say it could be used for another purpose because we're trying to work it. And so the site still belongs to us and we're still using it.
With great respect, you're not quite answering any of the three of our questions. The question was how well you negotiated. You knew the problem at the time when you renewed the lease last year. Did you renegotiate the lease sufficiently downwards to cover the costs of known costs, I would say at that point, or known that you were likely to have to vacate a considerable part of the prison? Did you negotiate downwards sufficiently, do you think?
So look, what I would say is they negotiated with us really well and they made some investment into the site and we continue to have negotiations with them as we find technical solutions, but I am still trying to find a technical solution to that site.
I don't think it's unusual to have to pay for a site if it's. I mean, it's as Amy's been talking about. There are still staff there. There's still work going on, and the committee was asking a question earlier about the balance between new build versus remediating places, and this is a kind of prime example of that. I think what we need to consider really carefully is it going to be cost effective to bring the prison back into use, and that's in this case unfortunately tied into some quite complicated scientific questions about radon and the health risks involved there. But you know, there are HMPPS staff on the site. If we had if you're renting a flat and the flat was empty while you were doing some decorating, you'd still have to pay for it, wouldn't you?
With respect, I think your questions only come into play if we determine that we cannot do anything with that site, we cannot find a technical solution.
Well, not quite, Ms. Rees, because you know that you've got considerable costs, and you knew at the time when you renegotiated. Now, we can't really ask a sensible question because we don't know how much investment they've put in, and we don't know how much you renegotiated the lease. All I'm just simply trying to find out, and I could ask you, I may ask you, in due course, having considered it, to give us the precise details on confidential terms. But can you reassure the committee, perhaps, to avoid me having to do that, because I know this is a sensitive subject, that you actually negotiated to make sure that your costs were well and truly covered when you renegotiated, either through investment from the Duchy or by reduction in the lease, that your costs have been well and truly covered?
I can certainly assure you that the renegotiation was a positive experience for HMPPS in which we got some benefits. But the other thing is, you're assuming I knew everything at the time of renegotiation, and I don't think that's true. So we had much more substantial radon levels and readings than we were expected in communal areas after the time that we renegotiated the lease.
I don't understand why it's taken you so long to work out that radon was a problem, because being brought up in the southwest and having lived there for 60 years, everybody knows there's radon on the moors, whether it's Exmoor or Dartmoor, and if you're required to get a mortgage on a house in those areas now, for 20 years you've had to get radon testing. A bit late to the game.
So we've been doing radon testing, and as we say, those levels were higher than we were anticipating. But also we're trying to work through with HSE what exactly would be safe levels, and that is not as absolute. There's quite a lot of detail to work through in that sense, because it is different from residential accommodation in terms of prisoners, because the amount of time they spend in confined spaces. So it's not exactly the same as residential property.
Why did you extend the lease for 25 years?
So first of all, there are options for how long we extend for what period, and then the period afterwards. And also because we're going to have to make significant investment. So frankly, if we make any investment, it's got to be over a considerable period of time.
So that implies that you are sure that the matters can be resolved?
No, we're not sure, as I've said, that we can find a technical solution. At the time of negotiating, we were more sure, though, because we've had higher radon levels since readings.
You could be stuck with a lease that you can't resolve, and then what happens?
Then we would go back to negotiating. And as I say, my genuine personal experience with the Duchy has been really positive. So if that is the situation that we get to, I'm confident we get round the table and see if we can find a solution for both parties.
All right, thank you. Well, we'll leave that for now. Clive Betts.
Just come back to fire safety. It's clearly a really important issue, and I understand from the reports we've had that there are currently 23,000 occupied prison places which don't meet current fire safety standards, but you're committed to put that right, make them all fire safety compliant by 2027. Are you still on course to do that, Mr. Rees?
I think we've already covered that the collapse of some companies may mean it's impossible to do them all by the end of 2027, but what we will do is take them out of use if they are not remediated by then.
Right. How many do you think you won't be able to do by 2027 that you're going to have to take out of use?
Look, I genuinely don't know the answer to that because we haven't managed yet to re-let all of the contracts that were originally under the supplier that's now gone into administration. What I can tell you, though, is we've averaged 4,000 places a year for the last couple of years, but the second year we've done a lot more places. So if we were to able to continue on the level we've been doing for the last year or so, we would get nearly all of those done. But I genuinely don't know sat in front of you today because we've got to re-let the contracts, which we haven't yet done.
Right, so you'd have to be going at something like 8,000 a year to...
Yeah, and that is possible.
Yeah. But how long will it be before you are likely to have a clearer understanding of what your future position will be on this?
6 months, probably.
Yep. Right. And in the meantime, you'll be looking at contingency measures if you have to take all those cells out of...
Yeah, I mean, we certainly won't have to take them all out of use, but whatever balance that we're left with, let's say for argument's sake it's 3,000 at this point, at the end of 2027, then we would definitely look. They would be factored into the projections, and then we would decide what we had to do to manage them. And that is, in a sense, like all the other things, like boilers, like staffing. 3 times a year, we re-look at the projection. It's all of these things that are factored in.
And have you got the resources necessary to complete all this work?
In terms of the funding?
Funding and, yes, capabilities.
Well, in terms of the funding, I think we've covered that earlier. In terms of maintenance monies, what we would need to do, how we would need to speed up getting something from the spending review. So at this point, the answer is no, but we've got a lot of negotiations to do. In terms of resources and project management, yes, I do think we do have that. And like I say, what we've averaged in the last year in particular would mean that was possible. But there are 2 factors that I'm still concerned about with maintenance in general. That's supplier capacity and the headroom in order to do the work at this level.
Thank you. Anna.
Yes, thank you. Earlier we were talking about the impact on prisoners, and you did raise the impact on staff themselves. So I think the committee would also like to recognise, the work that the staff are doing under very difficult conditions. You raised the issue, of recruitment, that you feel you've done very well on that. But recognise that the result of that is a dilution in experience. So I think in the NAO report, it suggests that the number of band 3 to 5 officers with 2 or more years of experience has decreased from 81% to 68% between June 21 and June 24. In addition, obviously, to having staff recruited is the need to retain. Clearly, working under these conditions is leading to sickness absence rates that would be higher than the civil service average, and also reports of burnout. So in order to secure not only the physical capacity, but the workforce capacity that you need to run the service, what are you going to do about workforce retention and well-being?
Yeah, so it's a really good set of questions. So on recruitment, we've already talked about what we've done and that it has led to a balance of experience and experience, but we've also done national campaigns for the first time. So some of you might have seen, but we now do an exceptional job done by someone like you, and it's been a really successful campaign. We then have to look at retention rates, which have come down. So we're now at about 8.5% in the last set of published figures. That has come down, but there is more to do. We do a lot of retention deep dives to try and look at the issues and what causes that. It's quite hyper-local, so the issue in Wood Hill might be a bit different from the issue in Berwyn, for example, as to why people leave or stay. But we also find it's a combination of what I would call kind of hygiene factors, like do I have a locker, did I have a line manager who met me on day one, and then big factors like pay and safety and all of those things. So we try and have an action plan for any sites that we recognise are struggling with retention and how we deal with that. And then in terms of well-being, look, I think there's three layers of what we do on well-being. The first is that you have to have a workload that is manageable. And we've talked about that, both of it in prisons and probation. Yes. That is the first thing. The second is then the respect that they do for an extraordinary job. And I think you only have to look at last week and the Southport trials to know what an outstanding job people in my organisation do. Because not only did they sit through that horrific kind of testament and statements, they then took him back to the establishment, and we will work with him for the 52 years that we have him. So it really is outstanding work, and they need respect, dare I say it, from committees like these in terms of what they do. Pay is another considerable factor. We have increased starting pay for prison officers quite considerably. We've had a 3-year multi-pay deal, and then there are kind of the human things that we do to support people. So the employee assistance programme, we've actually recruited a dedicated wellbeing support for each region in prisons and probation. So it's kind of right through from the hard, what's the workforce metrics, what do you do to pay people, right down to the human support.
Did you have targeted support for any staff who are victims themselves of assault? Or?
Yes, we do. We have the employee assistance programme, which provides counselling 24/7. We also have a really well-developed and well-regarded system of incident management, gold, silver, bronze. We do incident debriefs after those. And I do things like I write to any staff that are seriously assaulted, there's local support, etc. But there is genuinely always more we can do on this.
Any chance of getting any returners? I mean, given these experienced people have left you?
We have been working on returner campaigns. We've also been, as you will appreciate, being a prison officer in particular is a physically demanding job. Yes. And so there does come a point in your career.
Workforce, yes.
Yeah, there does come a point in your career when you might not want to do that. And what we try to do with those is think about them as maybe being trainers, maybe bringing them back to do support, because we've talked about the levels of balance of experience and experience. So we can use returners to come back and do some support work for new starters so that they can learn from someone with a lot of experience. So yeah, we are looking at returning campaigns.
But I only say that because I before I came to this place, I did a lot of work on age-friendly employers and how we enable people to work for longer. So exactly some of those would be very welcome, I am sure. I think that those are the main points I wanted to ask on workforce. We did touch on... the only thing, is your assumptions about the workforce you need are based on the fact that we are currently have a prisoner to prison officer ratio of 4:1. Is that safe? I mean, it's double the European average.
So look, that is just an average, and I'm honestly not sure how helpful that is. So in terms of my long-term high security estate, it would be very different, and in the open estate, it's very different on the opposite end of the scale. Yeah. So we genuinely, and it's governors and PGDs that decide what is the safe level of ratio for their prison, and it really does depend on the context. It also depends on things like we talked about earlier, lines of sight, the actual building that they're managing. Yes. So there are really local factors that determine how safe that is.
How do you plug all that into your long-term workforce strategy to be confident that you've got that longer-term supply of workers?
Well, Ross might want to say a little bit about how we do it analytically and how we manage our staffing profile. But I would say to you that we have done well. We haven't actually had to delay any opening of new places because of recruitment. So we've managed to recruit really well those that we need. We have had to do more work on retention, as we've talked about quite a lot. So I can honestly say I don't think our issue is forecasting accurately what we need. It's more about making sure these people feel valued and they stay. And we train them well.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to add anything, Ross?
I think Amy's put it very well. I mean, it's one of the things we model, and to date I think we've done so very successfully.
Conscious of time, so I'm satisfied. Thank you, Chair.
Well, can I just say, Ms. Rees, your points about your hard-working workforce, both in the prison service and in the probation service, are very well taken by this committee. We really do appreciate what they do. It's a tough job, and so that is much appreciated.
Thank you.
I think if there are other questions, I've got one sort of sweep-up questions for you, Dame Antonia, if I may, please. So last summer, after the riots, when some very quick sentences were handed out, your margins for vacancies in the prison were very, very tight indeed. Are you confident that if some other shock to the system like that happened again, we wouldn't be in a similar position through your supply side, demand side, bringing extra places on stream? Are you confident that it wouldn't happen again?
That what wouldn't happen again?
Well, that you were down to such thin margins at the time when the rioters were sentenced.
Well, all the work that we're doing is to try and ensure that we're not in that position. I mean, we were in a very difficult position at that time. Actually, the announcement had already been made of SDS 40, and although Tranche 1 hadn't happened, we were already, partly because we were in the summer, we were in a position when, thanks to the Herculean efforts of right across the CJS, and I should also at this point thank the judiciary for the work that they do with us in partnership, just partly reflecting on the discussions we were having earlier on sitting days. I think that at the moment right now, we do have some headroom. What we need to avoid doing is getting into a position where we have, fewer than 300 places available across the whole estate, because the maths at a time when, 1,000 people or nearly are being sentenced and many of those will go to custody, if you've only got 300 places left, then at that point the system has stopped to function. So essentially that's the whole purpose of everything that we're doing at the moment. The whole purpose of the publication is to get a strategic advanced look at things. The purpose of all the interventions that we do on the demand side and the supply side are to move away from a position where we are right up against the limits which would stop us being able to respond. I should say the first job of the whole of the CJS is to be able to provide a space for anybody that the independent judiciary sentences to custody, and that happened in that case and will continue to happen.
And if I may just add, we did survive and we did manage, and that's because people in the CJS were outstanding in this summer period. That's right across the CJS. But also that is the reason why tough decisions must be made by all parties, because we all witnessed, didn't we, in the summer, that you absolutely have to have a functioning CJS, and that when things get very difficult in society, it is to people like me and others across the CJS that we rely, and so we must be properly funded and prepared.
Well, I think on that note of warning, very well taken by this committee. Did you want to have the last word, Mr.
There's
Barton?
two very quick factual corrections, if that's okay, Chair. Apologies.
Yes.
I wasn't able to answer Mr. Charter's question earlier around the number of places that have been significantly delayed due to nutrient neutrality. The answer is about 300 with a really material delay. And then I misspoke earlier. I mentioned Ford had been delayed. And sorry, we built an additional contingency into the Ford plan. We're operating that plan as a P76 contingency, not a P43. Apologies.
I did think 43 sounded quite low for a public
I transposed two numbers in my mind, so apologies.
Yes. Well, thank you for making those corrections. So can I thank all our witnesses very much indeed. We've had an interesting hearing today, and we will be producing our report with recommendations shortly, and the uncorrected transcript of the hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days. And we will consider the evidence that you've kindly produced today, and as I say, produce a report in due course. So thank you again. Order.